Elderly black woman humiliated at the bank. But the mafia boss was there. Where did you get this kind of money? People like you don't have $200 in cash. Prove it's legitimate or get out. The words rang out across the marble-floored lobby of First Federal Bank, sharp enough to make several customers look up from their phones. The voice belonged to Jason Reynolds, a teller with slicked-back hair and a name tag polished to a shine that matched his too-white smile.
We must
He
ensure
wasn't
that every
making any
individual has
effort to
access
lower
to
his
the
voice
financial.
as he stared down at the elderly woman standing before his window, his expression a mixture of suspicion and disdain. Eleanor Wilkins didn't flinch, though her weathered hands, marked by decades of labor, trembled slightly as they clutched her carefully prepared envelope. At 73, she stood ramrod straight despite the arthritis that had settled into her joints after 50 years of scrubbing other people's floors. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and though her coat was worn at the elbows, it was immaculately clean. Around her, the grand lobby of First Federal fell into an uncomfortable silence. A woman in designer heels took a step back from the line. A man in a business suit glanced away, suddenly fascinated by his watch. No one spoke up. No one intervened. Eleanor's eyes revealed a fleeting hurt before hardening with dignity. She'd faced worse than this young man with his practiced sneer. She simply hadn't expected it here, not after being a customer for 30 years. What Jason Reynolds didn't notice, what none of them noticed, was the man standing 3 people back in line. In his tailored Italian suit and handcrafted leather shoes, Vincent Moretti blended perfectly with the bank's wealthy clientele. But his eyes, cold and calculating, hadn't left the unfolding scene for a moment. In exactly 7 minutes, everything would change at First Federal's main branch. And none of them knew that the man watching silently from the back of the line was about to become their worst nightmare. Eleanor Wilkins had woken before dawn that Tuesday morning, as she had nearly every day of her adult life. The habit was etched into her body's rhythm after decades of arriving at other people's homes before they woke, tidying their lives before they stepped out of bed. Though technically semi-retired, she still cleaned 3 houses a week to supplement her meager Social Security checks. The modest 2-bedroom house on Chicago's South Side had been home for 48 years. She and Walter had purchased it in 1976, the only black family on the block at the time. Walter had worked at the steel mill until it closed, then taken 2 janitorial jobs, until his heart gave out 7 years ago. Eleanor could still hear his deep laugh echoing through the empty rooms some mornings. "We own this free and clear, Ellie," he'd say every month when they made the mortgage payment. "Bit by bit, we're building something that's ours." They had paid off the mortgage 5 years before Walter's death, a moment they'd celebrated with sparkling cider and pot roast. But property taxes in the gentrifying neighborhood had steadily climbed, threatening the security they had worked so hard to build. This morning's bank visit was the culmination of 6 months of careful saving, 6 months of walking 3 miles each way to her cleaning jobs rather than taking the bus. 6 months of turning the thermostat down to 62 degrees through Chicago's bitter winter. 6 months of eating beans and rice for dinner 4 nights a week, all to save the $200 needed for the property tax bill due next week. Eleanor had counted the money 7 times last night, organizing the bills by denomination, the wrinkled singles and fives from her tip jar, the 20s from her cleaning jobs, all neatly stacked and recorded in her leather-bound ledger, a gift from Walter on their 40th anniversary. The ledger contained every penny they had earned and spent throughout their marriage. Walter had believed in accountability to each other and to themselves. "Your money tells your story," he used to say. "Make sure it tells one you're proud of." Eleanor was proud of this money. Each dollar represented her labor, her sacrifice, her determination to hold on to the last physical connection she had to Walter. The house contained half a century of memories, the door frame with pencil marks tracking their niece's and nephew's growth, the backyard garden where Walter had grown tomatoes every summer, the small bedroom they had painted yellow for the children they never had. As Eleanor had carefully placed the money in an envelope that morning, Her hands had trembled not from fear, but from the arthritis that made even buttoning her cardigan a challenge on cold mornings. She'd dressed in her best clothes, a navy blue dress she saved for church-sensible shoes, polished to a soft glow, and her good wool coat despite the spring warmth. Banking was serious business, and Eleanor Wilkins believed in showing respect. She never expected that respect wouldn't be returned. First Federal Bank's main branch occupied the ground floor of a towering glass and steel structure in Chicago's financial district. The building itself seemed to announce its importance with soaring columns and gleaming surfaces that reflected the morning sunlight in brilliant patterns across the marble floor. Eleanor had chosen to visit this branch rather than the smaller one closer to her neighborhood. The property tax payment was too important to risk any issues, and she had always believed the main branch would provide better service. As she entered through the heavy glass doors, the sudden blast of air conditioning made her pull her coat tighter around her thin shoulders. The space hummed with muted conversations and the gentle tapping of keyboards. Men and women in expensive suits moved with purpose, carrying leather portfolios and checking gold watches. Security guards with earpieces stood at strategic points, their eyes constantly scanning the room. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting a warm glow over leather seating areas where preferred customers consulted with financial advisors. Eleanor felt the weight of eyes following her as she moved slowly toward the teller line. Her sensible shoes made soft squeaking sounds against the polished floor, a discordant note in the symphony of power and wealth. Though her clothes were clean and neat, they carried the unmistakable wear of age and use that distinguished them from the crisp newness surrounding her. A young couple in matching business attire gave her a curious glance before returning to their conversation about vacation properties. A bank employee guiding a well-dressed older man to the investment services area stepped widely around Eleanor as if her modest circumstances might somehow be contagious. Eleanor kept her eyes forward, her posture straight. She had cleaned homes grander than this building. She had scrubbed floors for judges, doctors, and business executives who looked right through her as she polished their lives to a shine. Their dismissal could not touch her dignity. The teller line was divided between regular customers and those with premium accounts. Eleanor took her place in the regular line, clutching her envelope and her old leather purse. She noticed a bank employee gently guiding a white-haired man in golf attire from the regular line to the premium window with a deferential smile. The man looked no older than Eleanor, but his cashmere sweater and confident manner opened doors that remained closed to her. She didn't notice Vincent Moretti enter the bank 3 minutes after she did. Few people did. Despite his expensive suit and the subtle aura of authority that surrounded him, Vincent had perfected the art of blending in when necessary. He stood several people behind Eleanor in line, apparently absorbed in his phone, but his dark eyes missed nothing. Vincent had not planned to visit the bank that morning. His scheduled meeting with First Federal's senior executives wasn't until the afternoon, a private discussion about certain financial arrangements that benefited both the Moretti family businesses and the bank's bottom line. But he had arrived in the financial district early and on a whim decided to handle a minor personal transaction before his lunch reservation. Now, as he observed the elderly woman clutching her envelope with careful reverence, something in her dignified posture caught his attention. Perhaps it was the way she held herself straight-backed despite her years. Or perhaps it was the way others in the bank seemed to look past her, around her, through her, as if she were invisible. Vincent Moretti had built his empire on noticing what others overlooked. When Eleanor finally reached the front of the line, she approached window number 4, where Jason Reynolds sat. At 31, Jason had worked at First Federal for 3 years and considered himself destined for management. His ambition was matched only by his disdain for what he considered the tedious aspects of customer service. Next, he called without looking up, continuing to type on his computer. Eleanor placed her bank card and ID on the counter. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the gentle southern cadence she had never lost, despite decades in Chicago. "I'd like to make a deposit, please." Jason glanced up briefly, his eyes flicking over Eleanor with a dismissive assessment before he took her identification. "Account number?" he asked flatly. "It should be on my card there," Eleanor replied. "I've had the same account for 30 years. Jason sighed audibly as he typed in her information. His expression changed subtly as he viewed her account details, a small checking account with an average balance that rarely exceeded $300. "And what are you depositing today?" he asked, his tone now tinged with suspicion. Eleanor carefully placed the envelope on the counter. "Cash. $3,200 for my property taxes." Jason picked up the envelope between two fingers as if it might be contaminated. He opened it and peered inside his nose, wrinkling slightly at the sight of the worn bills. "Where did you get this kind of money?" he asked loudly. "People like you don't have $3,200 in cash. Prove it's legitimate or get out." Eleanor blinked, momentarily stunned by both the question and his volume. "Excuse me. You heard me?" Jason continued, now spreading the bills across the counter. "This is an unusual transaction for your account history. We have protocols for large cash deposits, especially when they seem—" He paused, looking her up and down, inconsistent with the customer's profile. Eleanor's cheeks warmed with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. "I earned this money cleaning houses. I've been saving for 6 months to pay my property taxes." Jason's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Do you have documentation? Pay stubs? Tax forms? Anything to verify the source of these funds? It's cash from my employers. Most of them pay me in cash. I've been cleaning for some of these families for decades." Eleanor's voice remained steady despite her growing discomfort. By now, several customers in nearby lines had turned to watch the interaction. A teller at the next window glanced over nervously before quickly returning to her own customer. "Mrs. Wilkins." Jason said, reading from his screen, "Your occupation is listed as housekeeper." The way he said the word made it sound like something shameful. "And suddenly you're depositing over 10 times your normal account balance in cash. Surely you understand why that raises red flags." "I'm depositing this money to pay my property taxes," Eleanor repeated, her voice growing firmer. "I've been a customer here for 30 years. That doesn't exempt you from our security protocols," Jason replied. He turned to call over his shoulder. "Diane, can you come here for a moment?" "Diane Foster." The branch manager approached with a practiced smile that faded as she assessed the situation. At 45, Diane had built her career by avoiding problems, not confronting them. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked, directing her question to Jason rather than Eleanor. "Unusual cash deposit," Jason replied. "No documentation of source. Potential compliance issue." Diane glanced at Eleanor, then at the spread of bills on the counter. "Mrs. Wilkins," Eleanor supplied. "Eleanor Wilkins." "Mrs. Wilkins, we have strict regulations about large cash deposits. Without proper documentation of where this money came from, we can't process this transaction." "This is my money," Eleanor said, her voice finally betraying a slight tremor. "I worked for it. I counted it. I'm just trying to deposit it to pay my taxes. Perhaps you should come back with your—" Diane paused delicately. "Employer. Someone who can verify the source of these funds. My employers are busy professionals. They're not going to take time off work to come to the bank with me," Eleanor said, disbelief creeping into her voice. "I've never had this problem before." "Banking regulations have tightened considerably," Diane replied smoothly. "It's for everyone's protection." "I'm not asking for protection," Eleanor said. "I'm asking to deposit my money into my account." Jason began gathering the bills, his movements brusque. "I'm afraid we can't help you today. You'll need to provide documentation for these funds. Tax forms, employment contracts, something official." Eleanor stood frozen, aware of the eyes on her back, the whispered comments. A lifetime of dignity seemed to crumble beneath the weight of this public humiliation. "People are watching," she said quietly. "You're treating me like a criminal." "Mrs. Wilkins, please lower your voice," Diane said. "We're simply following procedure." "Would you follow the same procedure for everyone?" Eleanor asked, her gaze moving pointedly to the premium service area where transactions were being conducted with smiles and handshakes. "That's quite enough," Jason said. "If you continue to make a scene, I'll have to ask security to escort you out." Eleanor felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. Slowly, with hands that now trembled visibly, she reached for her money, her ID, and her bank card. 50 years of honest work," she said softly. "And this is how I'm treated." As she turned to leave, her worn envelope clutched against her chest. Eleanor Wilkins held her head high, a queen without a crown, her dignity, the only shield against the stares of those who had witnessed her humiliation. Vincent Moretti observed the entire interaction with growing anger, though nothing in his impassive expression betrayed his emotions. He had perfected the art of the neutral mask through decades of negotiations where revealing too much could cost millions or lives. As the elderly woman turned to leave, something in her dignified posture, despite obvious distress, struck a chord deep within him. Her straight back and lifted chin reminded him painfully of his grandmother, Sophia Moretti, who had raised him after his parents' death. Nonna Sophia had cleaned houses well into her 70s, refusing Vincent's financial help out of the same pride he now recognized in Eleanor Wilkins. "You respect those who work hard," Nonna had told him countless times. "A person's worth isn't in their wallet, but in their character." This philosophy had shaped Vincent's approach to business, both legitimate and otherwise. The Moretti empire spanned construction companies, restaurants, shipping interests, and real estate holdings. That these businesses also provided excellent covers for certain other revenue streams was a carefully maintained secret. Vincent had come to First Federal that day for his quarterly meeting with their executive team. A meeting where, behind closed doors, certain accommodations were made for the Moretti family's financial needs. The banking industry's selective enforcement of regulations was something Vincent usually exploited rather than challenged. Yet watching Eleanor Wilkins being humiliated for trying to deposit honestly earned money triggered something visceral in him. He thought of Nonna Sophia coming home with hands raw from cleaning chemicals but refusing to complain. He remembered how she'd been treated by store clerks who saw her accent and worn clothes before they saw her humanity. Vincent had built his reputation on calculated decisions. Every action was measured against potential consequences. Intervening now would draw attention he typically avoided. It would complicate his relationship with First Federal, possibly jeopardizing arrangements that had taken years to establish. The smart play was to remain silent, to blend into the background as he'd intended. After all, this wasn't his problem. The woman was a stranger, her humiliation just another example of the world's casual cruelty. But as he watched Eleanor Wilkins clutch that envelope to her chest, her back straight despite the burden of public shame, Vincent made a decision that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the values his grandmother had instilled in him. Some lines shouldn't be crossed. Some behaviors couldn't be tolerated, not if he wanted to recognize himself in the mirror each morning. Vincent caught the eye of Marco Rivera, his right-hand man who had entered the bank shortly after him, and positioned himself near the door. A subtle nod communicated everything Marco needed to know. The younger man's hand moved casually to his pocket where his phone was already recording the incident. Vincent stepped out of line, buttoning his suit jacket with a deliberate motion. His decision was made. First Federal Bank was about to learn an expensive lesson about respect. "Did I just hear you correctly?" Vincent Moretti's voice cut through the murmur of the bank like a blade, quiet, precise, and unmistakably dangerous. Jason Reynolds looked up, irritation flickering across his face at the interruption, until he registered the speaker. Recognition dawned immediately, followed by a flash of fear. "Mr. Moretti," he stammered. "I didn't see you there." Evidently, Vincent replied, moving with unhurried confidence toward the counter. You were too busy humiliating an elderly customer to notice much of anything. The bank fell silent. Even the gentle clicking of keyboards ceased as every employee recognized the name. Vincent Moretti wasn't just wealthy. He was connected. His family's influence extended through Chicago's business community, political circles, and beyond into shadows most preferred not to acknowledge. Eleanor Wilkins stood frozen, her envelope still clutched protectively against her chest, confusion evident in her eyes as she watched the exchange. Sir, I was simply following bank protocol for unusual deposits. Jason said, his voice noticeably higher than before. Protocol. Vincent repeated the word, carrying a weight of contempt. He turned to Eleanor with a respectful nod. Ma'am, would you mind if I inquired about what happened here? Eleanor hesitated before responding. I was trying to deposit $200 for my property taxes. Money I earned cleaning houses. They said I need documentation. Vincent's gaze returned to Jason, then shifted to Diane Foster, who had taken an instinctive step backward. Documentation, he echoed. For cash earned through honest labor. Tell me, do you ask the same of all your customers? The lawyer who deposits cash fees, the restaurant owner making their weekly deposit, the college student whose parents give them spending money. Diane stepped forward, professional smile firmly in place despite her obvious anxiety. Mr. Moretti, perhaps we could discuss this in my office? No. Vincent cut her off smoothly. Since Mrs. Wilkins was humiliated publicly, we'll address this publicly. His voice remained conversational, almost pleasant, making the steel beneath his words all the more apparent. By now, Marco Rivera had positioned himself near the entrance, quietly ensuring that security guards remained passive observers. A few customers had discreetly taken out phones, sensing the drama unfolding was worth documenting. Banking regulations require, Jason began. I'm intimately familiar with banking regulations, Vincent interrupted, including the selective way they're enforced. He turned to address the branch manager directly. Ms. Foster, is it First Federal's policy to publicly accuse elderly customers of potential criminal activity when they attempt to deposit their savings? Of course not, Diane replied quickly. We treat all customers with respect. Do you? Vincent asked. Because from where I stood, I witnessed something quite different. He gestured toward Eleanor. This woman states she's been your customer for 30 years. Did anyone verify that before questioning her integrity? Did anyone offer her the courtesy of a private conversation rather than a public interrogation? Mr. Reynolds was following our procedures for unusual transactions. Diane insisted, though, with noticeably less conviction. Unusual, Vincent raised an eyebrow. Or simply unexpected from someone who looks like Mrs. Wilkins. The question hung in the air, uncomfortably direct. Several bank employees found sudden interest in their computer screens. That's not Jason started, but Vincent silenced him with a look. Mrs. Wilkins, Vincent said, turning to Eleanor with a gentler tone. May I ask how long you've been saving this money? 6 months, Eleanor replied, her voice steadier now. I work 3 houses a week. I've been putting aside every extra dollar to pay my property taxes. Vincent nodded before addressing Jason again. 6 months of honest labor. Yet you felt entitled to question the legitimacy of her money based on what exactly? Her age, her appearance, the modesty of her previous banking activity. Jason's face flushed. The transaction triggered our protocols. Fascinating, Vincent interrupted. I wonder if you could point out where in your protocols it suggests treating customers with contempt. Is public humiliation a written policy at First Federal or merely an enthusiastic personal interpretation on your part? By now, Thomas Whitfield, the regional director who happened to be visiting the branch that day, had emerged from the back offices. At 52, Thomas had navigated enough potential PR disasters to recognize one unfolding in real time. "Mr. Moretti," he said, approaching with an outstretched hand. "I apologize for any misunderstanding. If you'll allow me to—" "This isn't a misunderstanding," Vincent replied, ignoring the offered handshake. "It's a failure of basic human decency wrapped in the convenient language of policy and protocol." Thomas's smile remained fixed, though strain showed around his eyes. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately. I'm sure we can resolve." "I believe Mrs. Wilkins was hoping for a similar courtesy," Vincent said. "Instead, she was treated to a public accusation of potential fraud. So, no, I don't think privacy is called for at this stage." From her position at a nearby teller window, Lucia Hernandez, a 24-year-old Hispanic woman who had been employed at First Federal for just 8 months, watched the confrontation with growing tension. The scene playing out matched too many she had witnessed and been instructed to ignore. "Excuse me," she said suddenly, her voice small but determined. All eyes turned to her, and she visibly steeled herself before continuing. This happens a lot," Lucia Diane warned sharply. "That's not appropriate." "It's exactly appropriate," Vincent countered, focusing his attention on the young teller. "Please continue, Miss Hernandez." "Lucia Hernandez," she supplied. "And it's true. There's not an official policy, but there's an understanding about certain customers." Thomas Whitfield stepped forward. "Ms. Hernandez, that's quite enough. Return to your station immediately." "No," Vincent said quietly. "Let her speak." The authority in his voice created a bubble of silence around them. Lucia glanced nervously at her coworkers before continuing. "Some customers get flagged for extra scrutiny," she said. "Elderly people with sudden deposits. People who don't look like they should have money. We're told to report unusual activity, but what counts as unusual depends on who the customer is." As if encouraged by Lucia's bravery, an older African-American woman stepped forward from where she had been sitting in the waiting area. "Happened to me too, 3 months ago," she said. "I tried to withdraw $4,000 for my grandson's tuition money I'd saved for years. They made me bring in bank statements, ID even called my son to verify before they'd give me my own money." "Mrs. Johnson," Jason acknowledged stiffly. "That was a security precaution. But when my neighbor, a white woman my same age, came in to withdraw $5,000 for a cruise, you didn't question her at all," the woman, Rosalind Johnson, continued. "I was sitting right here. I saw it." Eleanor Wilkins, who had been watching silently, finally spoke. "So I'm not the only one?" "No, ma'am," Lucia confirmed softly. "You're definitely not." Vincent turned back to Thomas Whitfield, whose professional composure was visibly cracking. "It seems we have more than an isolated incident, Mr. Whitfield. We have what appears to be an established pattern. These are serious allegations that would require thorough investigation," Thomas replied carefully. "If there have been misunderstandings—" "Misunderstandings," Vincent repeated the word, dripping with disdain. A curious choice of words for what appears to be structured discrimination. From his position near the door, Marco Rivera caught Vincent's eye with a subtle gesture. More customers were recording now, phones raised without pretense. What had begun as a personal intervention was rapidly expanding into something with potentially larger implications. A security guard, Michael Peterson, who had been watching the exchange with increasing discomfort, unexpectedly spoke up. "Sir, I've worked security here for 3 years. I've seen it too. Certain customers get extra attention. It's not right, but it happens." Michael Diane hissed. "That is completely inappropriate." Vincent's expression remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. What would be inappropriate, Ms. Foster is allowing this behavior to continue unchallenged. He turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Wilkins, I believe you came here today to make a deposit. Let's see that transaction completed properly." Jason looked to Thomas for guidance, receiving a terse nod in response. "Process Mrs. Wilkins's deposit." Thomas instructed, his voice tight. Immediately, as Jason reluctantly began entering the transaction, Vincent addressed Eleanor again. "Mrs. Wilkins, I apologize for what you've experienced today. This isn't how a respected customer or any customer should be treated." Eleanor studied him for a moment, wariness and curiosity mingling in her expression. "Thank you for speaking up," she said finally. "Not many would." "More should," Vincent replied simply. Then, with a hard glance at Thomas Whitfield, "I believe you and I need to have a more extensive conversation about First Federal's practices, Mr. Whitfield. Shall we say in 30 minutes in your office I'll have some additional colleagues join us?" It wasn't a request, and Thomas knew it. "Of course, Mr. Moretti." As Jason processed the transaction, sliding a receipt across the counter with a subdued, "Thank you for your business," Eleanor Wilkins collected her papers with steady hands. The dignity that had never truly left her now radiated like a physical presence. Vincent Moretti watched her with quiet respect. What had begun as a spontaneous intervention had revealed something more troubling than he'd initially suspected, and Vincent Moretti had never been one to leave a job half-finished. As Eleanor accepted her receipt from Jason, the young bank teller avoided meeting her eyes. The lobby remained unusually silent, the normal business of the bank suspended in the tense aftermath of the confrontation. "Mrs. Wilkins," Vincent said, "would you be willing to join our discussion with Mr. Whitfield? Your experience should be heard directly, not filtered through others' interpretations." Eleanor hesitated, glancing at her watch. "I have a cleaning job at 1 o'clock. I'll ensure you're compensated for any lost wages," Vincent assured her. "Your perspective would be valuable." Before Eleanor could respond, the bank's front doors opened and Sophia Diaz entered. At 32, Sophia served as the financial investigator for the Moretti family's legitimate businesses, her sharp mind and attention to detail making her invaluable for both identifying opportunities and avoiding pitfalls. Her arrival was no coincidence. Marco had messaged her the moment Vincent intervened. Thomas Whitfield recognized Sophia immediately. She had represented Moretti interests in previous meetings with the bank. His expression tightened further. "Ms. Diaz," he acknowledged. "I didn't realize you would be joining Mr. Moretti today." "I go where I'm needed," Sophia replied coolly, her gaze taking in the scene before her. "And it seems I'm needed here." By now, other customers had begun to approach, some with their own stories of questionable treatment. Rosalind Johnson, the woman who had spoken up earlier, addressed Eleanor directly. "They made me feel like I was trying to steal my own money," she said. "Been banking here 35 years and they treated me like a criminal." A middle-aged Hispanic man added, "My mother tried to cash a check here last month, a refund check from the insurance company. They held it for 10 days for verification, even though the funds were guaranteed." Vincent observed as more stories emerged, each one revealing a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or isolated incidents. Thomas Whitfield's attempts to move the discussion away from the public lobby were failing as customers found their voices. "Perhaps we should document these experiences," Sophia suggested, producing a small tablet from her briefcase. "If you're comfortable sharing your contact information, we could follow up." "This is highly irregular," Thomas protested. "First, Federal has established channels for customer complaints, which appear to be remarkably ineffective." Vincent interjected smoothly, "given the number of similar experiences being shared." As if on cue, a well-dressed African-American man who had been observing quietly from a nearby seating area approached. "James Wilson," he introduced himself, offering Vincent a business card. "Banking oversight attorney. I happen to be here for a meeting, but I believe what I'm witnessing may be relevant to some cases my firm is investigating." Thomas Whitfield's professional facade cracked visibly. "Mr. Wilson, Any concerns should be addressed through proper legal channels. What I'm witnessing right now seems very proper to me, Wilson replied. Citizens sharing their experiences in a public space. No confidentiality being breached, just people speaking their truth. Eleanor, who had remained quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. I didn't know others had similar experiences. I thought it was just me. It's never just one person, Wilson said gently. Patterns like this don't emerge in isolation. Vincent, who had been quietly assessing the situation, made a decision. Mr. Whitfield, I believe our meeting should include Mr. Wilson and any other customers who wish to share their experiences. His tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. This is highly unorthodox, Thomas insisted, desperation edging into his voice. So is discriminating against customers based on age and appearance, Vincent countered. Yet that seems to be standard practice here. Diane Foster, sensing the situation spiraling beyond control, attempted to intervene. Mr. Moretti, we take all customer concerns seriously. If there have been misunderstandings... Stop saying misunderstandings. Eleanor interrupted, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. What happened to me wasn't a misunderstanding. That young man, she pointed at Jason, decided I didn't deserve respect the moment he saw me. That's not a misunderstanding. That's prejudice. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering crowd. Jason, his face now flushed with equal parts anger and embarrassment, attempted to defend himself. I was following protocol for unusual transactions. Then your protocol is fundamentally flawed, Vincent stated flatly, and those who implemented it are responsible for the consequences. Thomas Whitfield, recognizing the situation was beyond salvaging in the public sphere, made one final attempt to regain control. I propose we move this discussion to our conference room. Mr. Moretti, Mrs. Wilkins, Mr. Wilson, and any customers with specific concerns are welcome to join in a structured conversation. Vincent exchanged glances with Sophia and Marco, a silent communication born of years working together. Sophia gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Agreed, Vincent said. But I want Ms. Hernandez and Officer Peterson included as well. Their insights seem valuable. Thomas had no choice but to acquiesce. Very well. If you'll all follow me. As the impromptu group began moving toward the conference room, Eleanor found herself walking beside Vincent. I don't understand, she said quietly. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. Vincent considered her question seriously. My grandmother cleaned houses until she was 75, he replied after a moment. She taught me that respect isn't earned by wealth or status. It's a basic human right. What happened to you today shouldn't happen to anyone. Eleanor studied him with wise eyes that had seen too much of the world's injustice to be easily convinced. You have power they recognize. That's why they're listening now. Yes, Vincent acknowledged simply. And power that isn't used to protect those without it is wasted. As they entered the conference room, neither realized that what had begun as one woman's humiliation was about to expose a pattern that extended far beyond First Federal's marble lobby. The executive conference room of First Federal's main branch exuded wealth and authority. Cherrywood paneling lined the walls, a massive table dominated the center, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Chicago's financial district. It was a room designed to impress and intimidate. Thomas Whitfield took his position at the head of the table, out of habit, then faltered as Vincent Moretti deliberately chose the same seat at the opposite end. Sophia Diaz and Marco Rivera flanked Vincent, while James Wilson sat beside Eleanor Wilkins. Lucia Hernandez and Officer Peterson positioned themselves nervously near the door, as if contemplating a quick escape. Rosalind Johnson and 3 other customers who had shared complaints completed the unusual gathering. Before we begin, Vincent said, I want to establish that everyone in this room has the right to speak without fear of retaliation. He focused pointedly on Lucia and Officer Peterson, Is that understood, Mr. Whitfield Thomas forced a tight smile. Of course. First, federal values transparent communication. Excellent, Vincent replied. Then let's start with transparency. Ms. Hernandez mentioned an understanding about certain customers. I'd like to hear more about that. All eyes turned to Lucia, who swallowed hard before speaking. When I was trained, I was told to watch for unusual activity. But what counts as unusual depends on the customer. Could you be more specific? James Wilson prompted gently. Large cash transactions from elderly customers are automatically flagged as suspicious, Lucia explained, especially if they're minorities. We're supposed to ask extra questions, request documentation that isn't technically required. Is this written in any training manual? Sophia asked, her tablet ready. No, Lucia admitted. It's just how we're trained. What we're told to do. Thomas interjected quickly. First Federal has comprehensive anti-money laundering protocols that apply to all customers equally. If there have been misinterpretations by individual employees, it's not a misinterpretation, Officer Peterson cut in. Sorry, sir, but it's not. I watch it happen every day. Different rules for different people. Eleanor leaned forward. When I came in today, there was a white gentleman who was moved from the regular line to the premium service area. He looked about my age. Was he asked for documentation for his transactions? Thomas avoided her gaze. Premium account holders have different service parameters. That's not what I asked. Eleanor persisted. Would he have been questioned the way I was if he made the same deposit? The uncomfortable silence that followed was answer enough. Vincent turned to Sophia. I believe we should examine some data. Mr. Whitfield, I'd like to see statistics on transaction flagging by customer demographic. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. That would require proper authorization, and I sit on the board of your parent company. Vincent interrupted smoothly. I believe that constitutes proper authorization. The revelation sent a visible shock through the room. Even Marco raised an eyebrow, not having been aware of this particular Moretti holding. You're on the board of Midwest Financial Partners? Thomas asked, his voice notably weaker. Through a subsidiary, yes, Vincent confirmed. A recent acquisition. I prefer to understand my investments from all angles, including customer experience. Thomas's complexion had taken on a grayish tone. I wasn't informed. Evidently, there are many things you haven't been informed about, Vincent observed dryly, including how your branch treats valuable long-term customers. James Wilson, who had been taking notes, looked up. As a banking oversight attorney, I should mention that what's being described here potentially violates several federal regulations, including the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and possibly the Fair Housing Act, depending on how mortgage applications are handled. Thomas began to protest, but Vincent cut him off with a raised hand. Before we hear more denials, I'd like to see the data. He turned to Sophia. Ms. Diaz, would you assist Mr. Whitfield in accessing the relevant information? For a moment, it seemed Thomas might refuse. Then, with visible reluctance, he turned to the computer terminal embedded in the conference table. While Sophia worked with Thomas, Vincent addressed Eleanor and the other customers. I apologize for what you've experienced. It's unacceptable and it will be addressed. Words are easy, Rosalind Johnson replied skeptically. I filed a complaint 3 months ago. Nothing changed. This time will be different, Vincent assured her. Why, Eleanor asked directly. Because you're involved. What happens when you leave? We go back to being invisible. Before Vincent could respond, Sophia straightened from where she'd been reviewing data with Thomas. Her expression was grim. I've pulled transaction flagging statistics for the past 18 months, she announced. The pattern is unmistakable. She tapped a command and a graph appeared on the large screen at the end of the room. The visual representation was damning transaction reviews, and holds were disproportionately applied to elderly customers and minorities, with the highest rates affecting those who fell into both categories. This could be coincidence, Thomas suggested weakly. Higher risk profiles. I also found this, Sophia interrupted, displaying an email chain on the screen. Internal communications regarding what's called the Enhanced Scrutiny List. The emails dated just 3 months earlier explicitly instructed branch managers to apply additional verification steps for demographically higher risk customers, while ensuring premium clients experience minimal friction. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications became clear. That's not coincidence, James Wilson stated flatly. That's structured discrimination. Eleanor Wilkins stared at the screen, her expression a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. All these years, she said quietly. All these years I thought it was just me. Vincent turned to Thomas, whose attempt at maintaining professional composure had completely collapsed. I believe we need to expand this discussion. Get Gregory Andrews on video conference immediately. The bank president, Thomas, stammered. He's in New York today. Then New York is about to join our conversation, Vincent replied. Now, Mr. Whitfield. As Thomas fumbled with the conference system, Officer Peterson unexpectedly spoke up again. There's something else you should know. The bank has a code system for certain customers. They call it account risk management, but it's really about who gets hassled and who doesn't. Explain, Vincent prompted. Customer accounts are color-coded in the system. Peterson continued. Green for premium clients, no questions asked, full service. Yellow for standard verification, normal checking of ID and such. Red for enhanced verification, basically permission to make things difficult. And how are customers assigned these colors? James Wilson asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. It's supposed to be based on account history and transaction patterns, Peterson replied. But I've watched new accounts being coded red before the customer has any history at all. It's about how they look, how they talk, how they dress. Sophia was already searching through the system. Found it, she announced grimly. Account coding protocols, and look who has override authority for code assignments. She displayed another screen showing Diane Foster and Jason Reynolds among those listed. At that moment, the large screen flickered and divided one half showing the data, while the other displayed the face of Gregory Andrews, First Federal's president. At 65, Andrews had the polished appearance of a man who believed appearance was inseparable from success. Thomas. He began, clearly annoyed at the unexpected call. I'm in the middle of... He stopped abruptly as he registered the assembled group. What is this? Mr. Andrews Vincent said, taking control of the conversation. My name is Vincent Moretti. We have a significant situation at your Chicago main branch that requires your immediate attention. Gregory's annoyance transformed into alarm at the name. Mr. Moretti, I wasn't aware you had interests in First Federal. My interests are expanding, Vincent replied coolly. Currently, they include understanding why your bank has implemented what appears to be a structured system of discrimination against elderly and minority customers. Sophia efficiently shared the data on screen, walking Gregory through the evidence they had uncovered. With each revelation, the bank president's expression grew more grave. This is deeply concerning, Gregory finally said, his corporate damage control instincts kicking in. If these practices have occurred, they are absolutely contrary to First Federal's values and policies. I assure you we will conduct a thorough investigation. That investigation has already begun, Vincent interrupted. And it will continue under independent oversight. He nodded toward James Wilson. What we're discussing now are immediate corrective actions and accountability. Eleanor, who had been listening quietly, suddenly addressed the bank president directly. Mr. Andrews, I've been your customer for 30 years. Today I was treated like a criminal for trying to deposit money I earned through honest work. Money to pay my property taxes. Is that how First Federal values its loyal customers? Gregory Andrews had faced shareholder revolts and federal regulators, but something in the quiet dignity of Eleanor's question seemed to affect him differently. "No, ma'am," he replied, the corporate Polish momentarily falling away. "It is not, and I personally apologize for what you experienced today." "Apologies are a start," Vincent said. "Actions will determine whether they're meaningful." As the gravity of the situation settled over the room, it became clear to everyone present that what had begun as one woman's humiliation had exposed a pattern of discrimination that could no longer be denied or dismissed as isolated incidents. The question now was what would be done about it. The revelation of First Federal's coded customer system had shifted the dynamic in the conference room. What had begun as an isolated incident involving Eleanor Wilkins had expanded into evidence of widespread discriminatory practices. The implications were significant, not just for those present, but potentially for thousands of customers across the bank's network. As Gregory Andrews, Thomas Whitfield, and the other bank executives huddled in a corner attempting to formulate a response, a young woman hesitantly entered the conference room. In her mid-20s, Alexis Torres carried a leather portfolio and a determined expression, despite her obvious nervousness. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the table where Vincent, Eleanor, and the others sat. "My name is Alexis Torres. I work in account services here at First Federal." Thomas immediately moved toward her. "Ms. Torres, this is a private meeting. You should return to your desk immediately." "Actually," Alexis replied, her voice growing firmer, "I think what I have is relevant." She placed her portfolio on the table. "I've been documenting discrepancies in how different customers are treated for the past year." Vincent assessed the young woman with interest. "What kind of discrepancies, Ms. Torres? Application approvals, loan terms, service access fee waivers," Alexis listed, all broken down by customer demographics and account classification. James Wilson leaned forward. "You've been collecting this data on your own initiative?" Alexis nodded. "After I noticed patterns that didn't seem right. Customers who should have qualified for better rates being denied. Others receiving preferential treatment despite lower credit scores or account balances." Thomas attempted to intervene again. "Any internal documents are confidential bank property. Actually," James interjected, "documentation of potentially discriminatory practices is protected under whistleblower statutes. Ms. Torres has every right to present her findings." Alexis placed her hand protectively on her portfolio. "I started tracking these patterns after my grandmother was denied a home equity line despite having perfect credit and 60% equity in her home. A white couple with lower scores and higher debt-to-income ratios was approved the same day. Isolated examples don't constitute evidence of structured discrimination," Gregory Andrews stated from the video screen, having recovered some of his corporate composure. "It's not isolated," Alexis countered, opening her portfolio to reveal meticulously organized spreadsheets and documentation. "I have data on 347 applications over the past 10 months. The pattern is consistent across loan types, account services, and branch locations." Sophia Diaz immediately moved to review the materials, her professional assessment evident in her expression. "This is comprehensive," she noted with obvious respect, "and it correlates with what we've already uncovered." Rosalind Johnson, who had been relatively quiet, suddenly spoke up. "So it's not just happening here. It's everywhere. All 5 Chicago branches at minimum," Alexis confirmed. "I didn't have access to data beyond this region." Eleanor Wilkins studied the young woman with newfound hope. "Why did you decide to speak up now?" "You're risking your job." Alexis met Eleanor's gaze steadily. "Because what happened to you today happens every day, and it's wrong. My parents taught me that staying silent when you witness injustice makes you complicit in it." A noble sentiment, Gregory Andrews remarked from the screen, his tone suggesting he found it naive. However, banking is a complex industry with numerous regulations and risk factors that must be— "Don't," Vincent interrupted sharply. "Don't attempt to obscure discrimination behind banking jargon. What we're seeing here isn't complex. It's wrong, and based on Ms. Torres's documentation, it's not accidental." James Wilson had been reviewing Alexis's materials with increasing interest. This could substantiate a class action, he noted. The pattern is remarkably consistent. At this comment, Gregory Andrews's expression shifted from defensive to alarmed. Class action lawsuits against banks frequently resulted in multi-million-dollar settlements and devastating publicity. First Federal is committed to addressing any legitimate concerns. He began carefully. "If there have been procedural irregularities," Eleanor interrupted, her patience visibly fraying. "Is that what you call it when your employees humiliate people because of how they look, when they make assumptions about where money comes from based on skin color or age? Those aren't irregularities, Mr. Andrews. That's prejudice, plain and simple." Her words hung in the air, unadorned and powerful in their truth. The door opened again, and a middle-aged African-American man in a well-tailored suit entered. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. "I'm David Thompson from the Chicago Banking Association. Mr. Andrews asked me to join this discussion." Vincent recognized the move immediately. Bringing in an African-American banking executive was an obvious attempt to change the optics of the situation. His estimation of Gregory Andrews' cunning rose slightly, even as his opinion of the man's character diminished. "Mr. Thompson," Vincent acknowledged. "I believe you'll find this discussion enlightening. We were just reviewing evidence of structured discrimination across First Federal's Chicago branches." David Thompson maintained a neutral expression as he was quickly briefed on what had been discovered. His presence complicated the dynamic. He was clearly sent to help manage the situation. Yet as an African-American man, he could hardly dismiss the evidence without compromising his own integrity. "This is deeply concerning," Thompson finally stated. "The Chicago Banking Association has clear standards regarding equitable service." He turned to Gregory Andrews on the screen. "Greg, this requires immediate intervention, not just damage control." The subtle shift was significant. Thompson was positioning himself as an advocate for reform rather than a defender of the bank's practices. Sensing the changing tide, more allies began to emerge. A bank employee who had been silently observing from the doorway stepped forward to share her observations of differential treatment. Another customer who had arrived for an unrelated appointment joined the group after overhearing the discussion. Vincent observed these developments with satisfaction. What had begun as his solitary intervention had evolved into something more powerful, a coalition of concerned individuals from different positions within and outside the bank, united by a common commitment to fairness. Eleanor Wilkins, who had arrived that morning simply hoping to deposit her savings, now found herself at the center of an impromptu movement for banking equality. The very institution that had attempted to diminish her had instead become the stage for her unexpected advocacy. "What happens next?" she asked Vincent quietly as others continued reviewing the accumulated evidence. That Vincent replied depends largely on what you want to happen. This began with your experience. Your voice should guide the response. Eleanor considered this thoughtfully. For decades, she had navigated a world that routinely underestimated her. She had cleaned the homes of the wealthy, cared for their children, maintained their comfort, all while being treated as somehow less than those she served. The irony that her voice now carried such weight was not lost on her. "I want accountability," she finally said. "Not just apologies. Real change that helps everyone. Not just me." Vincent nodded with approval. "Then that's what we'll pursue." As the alliance of customers, employees, and advocates continued to strengthen around the conference table, the path forward began to take shape. What had begun as one woman's humiliation was transforming into a catalyst for structural reform that would extend far beyond First Federal's marble lobby. As documents continued to circulate and conversations splintered into focused discussions of legal implications and potential remedies, Eleanor Wilkins sat quietly observing. Though others now dominated the technical aspects of the meeting, she remained its emotional center, the spark that had ignited this unexpected gathering. Vincent noticed her thoughtful silence and leaned closer. "You seem contemplative, Mrs. Wilkins." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I'm remembering something my husband Walter used to say. Truth needs a witness to become power. All these years, these things happened to so many of us, but we suffered them alone. No witnesses, no power." "And now," Vincent prompted. "Now the truth has witnesses," Eleanor replied simply. Their conversation was interrupted as Gregory Andrews attempted to regain control of the situation from his video screen. "I believe we should establish a structured process for addressing these concerns," he announced. "First Federal will conduct a thorough internal audit conducted by whom James Wilson challenged. The same leadership that implemented these practices. We would naturally engage independent consultants," Gregory began. No, Eleanor's voice cut through the discussion with surprising authority. All eyes turned to her as she rose slowly from her seat, the arthritis in her knees making the movement deliberate. "Mrs. Wilkins," Gregory responded clearly, surprised by her intervention. "I've been listening to all of this, the evidence, the legal terms, the corporate promises," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "And I keep thinking about all the people who aren't in this room, people who were turned away, charged extra fees, made to feel small and unworthy, but who didn't have Mr. Moretti to speak up for them." The room fell silent as Eleanor continued. "I was a civil rights activist in my youth," she revealed, surprising many present. "Marched in Selma when I was 18. Registered voters in Mississippi the year after. My husband Walter and I met fighting for fair housing in Chicago in the 1970s. This revelation cast Eleanor in a new light. The elderly woman they had initially seen as just a victim of discrimination was suddenly revealed as a lifelong advocate for justice. "Banking wasn't always like this," she continued. "When Walter and I opened our account at First Federal, it was because this bank had a reputation for serving the community, all of the community. The branch manager knew our names. He came to Walter's funeral 7 years ago." Eleanor's gaze swept across the room, connecting with each person present before settling on Gregory Andrews' image. "What happened today wasn't just about me being humiliated. It wasn't just about Jason Reynolds being cruel or Diane Foster looking the other way. It was about a system that decided some people deserve respect and others don't. A system that judges worth by appearance rather than character." Eleanor reached into her purse and withdrew a small, worn leather booklet. "This is my bank book from when Walter and I opened our account in 1989. 33 years of loyalty to this institution, and today I was treated like a criminal for trying to pay my property taxes." She placed the bank book on the conference table, the simple object somehow more powerful than all the digital evidence displayed on screens around the room. "Mr. Andrews, do you know what the Community Reinvestment Act requires of banks like yours?" she asked. Gregory appeared taken aback by the question. "In general terms, it mandates that banking institutions meet the needs of all segments of the communities they serve, including low and moderate income neighborhoods." That's the textbook answer Eleanor acknowledged. But what it really means is that banks that accept deposits from a community have an obligation to serve that entire community, not just the wealthy parts, not just the white parts. She turned to James Wilson. "Mr. Wilson, as an attorney, could you tell us First Federal's CRA rating from their last federal assessment?" Wilson quickly searched on his tablet. They received a satisfactory rating. He replied, then looked up with newfound understanding. "Though given what we've seen today, that rating may have been based on incomplete information. I'd like to see the actual lending and service data that supported that rating Eleanor stated, and I'd like to compare it with the real practices we've uncovered today." Thomas Whitfield shifted uncomfortably. "Those reports are complex regulatory filings that are publicly available." Eleanor finished for him. "My husband served on the Community Advisory Board for Chicago banks for 15 years. I helped him review those reports every quarter. The revelation caused a visible reassessment around the room. This wasn't just an elderly housekeeper who had been mistreated. This was a knowledgeable advocate with a deep understanding of banking regulations and community obligations." Mrs. Wilkins, Gregory Andrews, said, his tone markedly more respectful. "Your experience and knowledge are clearly valuable. I would welcome your input as we address these issues." "That's a start," Eleanor replied. "But addressing issues isn't enough. This requires structural change, new policies, new training, new accountability, and, most importantly, new attitudes." She turned to Vincent. "Mr. Moretti, you have influence here, but lasting change can't depend on your presence. It has to become part of how this bank operates every day with every customer, whether you're watching or not." Vincent nodded, impressed by her clarity of vision. "What do you propose, Mrs. Wilkins?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "First, immediate consequences for discriminatory behavior. Not just Jason Reynolds, but anyone who implemented or enforced these practices. Second, an independent audit of all policies and practices conducted by outside experts with community representation, not just banking consultants who speak the same language as management. Third, a community accountability board with real authority, not just advisory capacity to oversee changes and ensure they're maintained. Fourth, financial restitution to customers who have been harmed through excess fees, denied services, or discriminatory practices." The comprehensiveness of her proposal stunned many in the room. This was not a victim seeking personal redress. This was an experienced advocate outlining structural reform. And fifth, Eleanor concluded a public acknowledgement of what happened here, not a carefully worded press release, but an honest recognition of how this bank has failed its community and how it intends to do better. When she finished speaking, the silence in the room was profound. Then, from an unexpected source, came the first response. "She's right," Diane Foster said quietly from the corner where she had been standing. All eyes turned to the branch manager in surprise. "Mrs. Wilkins is right," Diane repeated more firmly this time. "I've seen these practices. I've implemented them. I've trained others to follow them, and I've watched what they do to people, to our customers, to our community, to our own employees." She looked directly at Eleanor. "I'm sorry. Not just for today, but for every time someone like you was made to feel unwelcome or unworthy in this bank." The admission created a ripple effect. Lucia Hernandez spoke next, then other employees, each acknowledging their role in a system they had recognized as wrong but felt powerless to change. Vincent watched as Eleanor Wilkins, the elderly woman who had entered the bank that morning simply hoping to deposit her savings, became the catalyst for confession, recognition, and commitment to change. In that moment, he understood that his intervention had merely opened the door. Eleanor's courage, knowledge, and moral authority were what would truly transform First Federal Bank. The initial revelations in the conference room had only scratched the surface. As Vincent insisted on deeper access to the bank's systems and data, the full extent of the discriminatory practices began to emerge. Sophia Diaz, with assistance from Alexis Torres, methodically documented patterns that extended far beyond the visible mistreatment Eleanor had experienced. "We need to move this to a more secure environment," Vincent decided, noticing how the crowded conference room was limiting their ability to conduct a thorough investigation. "Mr. Whitfield, is there a more suitable workspace where Ms. Diaz can access your systems properly?" Thomas Whitfield, now functioning largely as a facilitator rather than an authority figure, nodded quickly. "We can use the executive suite on the third floor. It has multiple workstations and private meeting areas. Excellent, Vincent replied. Ms. Diaz, Ms. Torres. Mr. Wilson, I suggest you relocate there to continue your analysis. Marco will accompany you. His tone made it clear this wasn't merely a suggestion. As that team prepared to move, Vincent turned to Gregory Andrews, who remained connected via video conference. Mr. Andrews, I believe it's time for you to join us in person. How quickly can you return to Chicago? Gregory appeared startled by the directness of the request. I'm in the middle of meetings with our East Coast investors. I think we both recognize that what's happening in Chicago takes precedence, Vincent interrupted smoothly. Your investors will understand when they learn the potential liability facing First Federal if these issues aren't addressed immediately. The implied threat wasn't subtle. Gregory's expression tightened, but he nodded. I can be on a private flight within the hour. I'll arrive by late afternoon. Perfect, Vincent replied. In the meantime, I suggest you connect Mr. Thompson with your board of directors. They should be fully informed of the situation. As these arrangements were being made, Eleanor approached Vincent. I should get going, she said quietly. I have clients expecting me. Vincent considered this, then made a decision. Mrs. Wilkins, your presence has been invaluable today. Would you consider postponing your appointments and continuing to assist us? As you pointed out, lasting change requires community oversight, and you've demonstrated both knowledge and commitment that we need. Eleanor hesitated, clearly torn between her work obligations and the unexpected opportunity to effect meaningful change. Your clients will understand, Vincent added, and as I mentioned before, you'll be fully compensated for your time. After a moment's consideration, Eleanor nodded. I'll need to make some calls. Of course, Vincent replied. And while you do that, I'd like to discuss something with you, a more formal role in what happens next. As Eleanor stepped away to contact her clients, the investigation expanded to the executive suite on the third floor. The space couldn't have been more different from the public areas of the bank. Where the lobby projected institutional formality, the executive suite exuded exclusive luxury custom furniture, original artwork, and panoramic views of the Chicago skyline. Sophia Diaz wasted no time establishing her command center at the main workstation. With Alexis Torres providing internal navigation and James Wilson identifying legally relevant evidence, they began a systematic examination of First Federal's practices. Start with the customer coding system Vincent instructed as he joined them. I want to understand exactly how accounts are classified and who authorized this approach. Sophia nodded, her fingers already flying across the keyboard. I'm accessing the account management protocols now. She paused, frowning at the screen. This is interesting. The coding system was implemented 18 months ago as part of what they called the Client Relationship Optimization Initiative. That's when Thomas Whitfield was promoted to regional director, Alexis added. The entire customer service approach changed after he took over. Sophia continued digging. The initiative originated from the corporate strategy team, but look who signed off on the implementation directive. She pointed to a signature on the digital document. Gregory Andrews. Vincent read his expression hardening. So this wasn't just branch-level interpretation. It came from the top. James Wilson leaned in to examine the document. This could significantly expand potential liability. If the discriminatory practices were directed by executive leadership rather than resulting from individual branch decisions, it suggests corporate-level culpability. As they continued investigating, Eleanor Wilkins returned from making her calls. Vincent noticed that despite the exhausting morning, she carried herself with renewed energy, the opportunity to address long-standing injustice seeming to invigorate her. My clients were very understanding, she reported, especially when I explained what was happening. I'm glad to hear it, Vincent replied, then gestured around the luxurious suite. Quite different from the lobby, isn't it? Eleanor took in the expensive furnishings and privileged view. 2 different worlds under one roof, she observed. tells you everything about their priorities. Vincent nodded in agreement, then turned serious. Mrs. Wilkins, I mentioned a more formal role for you in what happens next. I believe your experience and perspective would be invaluable in overseeing the changes First Federal needs to make. Eleanor looked skeptical. You mean like serving on some advisory committee? Banks create those all the time. They meet quarterly, receive reports, make recommendations that get filed and forgotten. No, Vincent replied firmly. I'm thinking of something with actual authority. A position on the Community Accountability Board that would have veto power over policy changes, access to internal data, and a direct line to the board of directors. Eleanor's expression shifted from skepticism to surprise. That's not how banks typically operate. Perhaps that's exactly the problem, Vincent observed. Traditional banking governance has clearly failed to prevent discriminatory practices. New perspectives and new authority structures may be necessary. Before Eleanor could respond, Sophia called them over to her workstation. You need to see this, she said urgently. On the screen was an internal memo dated 6 months earlier outlining efficiency metrics for customer service representatives. The document explicitly rewarded employees for converting high-maintenance accounts to more appropriate financial institutions, corporate language for pushing certain customers out. They were incentivizing staff to discourage undesirable customers. Sophia explained her disgust evident. Bonuses were tied to reducing the number of small accounts held by elderly and minority customers. How widespread was this program? Vincent asked. System-wide, Sophia confirmed grimly. All Chicago branches at minimum, possibly beyond. James Wilson shook his head in disbelief. This goes beyond discriminatory service. This is a deliberate strategy to reshape their customer base by driving away legally protected classes of customers. As they continued to uncover evidence, a clearer picture emerged. First Federal had been engaged in a coordinated effort to upgrade its customer profile by systematically discouraging certain demographic groups while cultivating wealthy, predominantly white clients. The practices included differential application of security protocols based on customer appearance, higher fees applied to smaller accounts typically held by elderly and minority customers, reduced staffing in branches serving diverse neighborhoods, closure of ATMs in low-income areas, increased documentation requirements for routine transactions based on customer coding, different script requirements for customer service representatives based on account classification. By mid-afternoon, the evidence had mounted into an irrefutable case of structured discrimination. This is far worse than isolated incidents of poor service, Vincent concluded. This is a calculated strategy implemented across multiple levels of the organization. Eleanor, who had been reviewing the findings with increasing dismay, finally spoke. All these years I thought it was just me, that maybe I was too sensitive or expecting too much, but they were doing it on purpose. The hurt in her voice was palpable, but so was the righteous anger. This wasn't just about her experience anymore. It was about a fundamental betrayal of community trust. The question now, Vincent said, is how we transform this evidence into meaningful change. He turned to Eleanor. And that's why your involvement is so crucial. This can't just be about legal settlements or corporate restructuring. It has to address the real impact on people's lives. Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. You're not what I expected, Mr. Moretti. How so? He asked. When you first stepped in, I thought you were just another wealthy man flexing his power doing a good deed that cost you nothing. But this, she gestured to the ongoing investigation. This is different. This is commitment. Vincent considered her assessment. My grandmother used to say that power without purpose is just noise. Making a scene in the lobby would have been noise. Making lasting change that has purpose. Their conversation was interrupted as Marco entered with news. Gregory Andrews' flight has landed. He'll be here within 30 minutes. Vincent nodded, then addressed the room. Let's consolidate what we've found. When Mr. Andrews arrives, I want him to understand exactly what his bank has been doing and exactly what it will take to fix it. As they prepared for the bank president's arrival, the investigation had revealed far more than anyone had anticipated. What had begun as one woman's humiliation had exposed a web of discriminatory practices woven deeply into First Federal's operations. The stage was now set for confrontation, accountability, and the potential for meaningful reform that could extend far beyond a single bank branch. The executive suite hummed with tension as Gregory Andrews entered, flanked by two members of First Federal's legal team who had accompanied him from New York. His confident stride faltered slightly as he took in the scene, computer screens displaying damning internal documents, printed evidence organized in neat stacks, and the unexpected assembly of individuals who had transformed from victims to investigators in the space of a few hours. Mr. Moretti Gregory acknowledged with a tight smile. "I see you've made yourself at home." "We've been productive," Vincent replied coolly. "Your systems are quite illuminating when properly examined." Gregory's gaze swept across the room, lingering briefly on Eleanor Wilkins before settling on James Wilson. The presence of a banking oversight attorney clearly concerned him more than he wanted to show. "I understand there have been some concerning findings," Gregory began diplomatically. "First Federal takes any allegations of improper practices very seriously." "These aren't allegations," Sophia interrupted, swiveling her screen toward him. "These are your bank's own documents, Mr. Andrews, implemented under your signature." Gregory adjusted his tie, a subtle tell that Vincent immediately noted. Banking operations involve complex compliance frameworks that may appear problematic when viewed without proper context. "Stop." Vincent cut in. "The time for corporate evasion has passed. We've spent the afternoon documenting a pattern of deliberate discrimination embedded in your bank's policies and practices. The question now isn't whether it happened, but what you're going to do about it." Gregory glanced at his lawyers, who remained stone-faced. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Moretti?" "I'm not proposing anything yet," Vincent replied. "First, I want to hear from Mrs. Wilkins. She's the one whose dignity was violated in your lobby this morning. She's the one who has been a loyal customer for 3 decades despite being treated with increasing disrespect. Her voice should lead this conversation." All eyes turned to Eleanor, who straightened in her chair, the afternoon's discoveries having reinforced rather than diminished her resolve. "Mr. Andrews," she began, "I came to your bank today to deposit money I earned cleaning houses, money saved over 6 months to pay my property taxes. I was publicly humiliated, accused of potential fraud, and nearly turned away. If Mr. Moretti hadn't intervened, I would have left in tears, my dignity shattered." Gregory began to offer what was clearly a prepared apology, but Eleanor raised her hand to stop him. "I don't want your practiced words," she continued. "What I want, what every customer deserves, is action. Your bank has systematically pushed away people who look like me, who live in neighborhoods like mine, who save in small amounts rather than invest in large ones. That isn't just poor customer service. It's wrong." She leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "So here's what needs to happen. Jason Reynolds should be terminated immediately, not because he made a mistake, but because he implemented exactly the culture your bank created. Diane Foster should be placed on administrative leave pending a complete review of her management practices." Gregory glanced at his lawyers again, clearly uncomfortable with such specific personnel decisions being dictated by a customer. Furthermore, Eleanor continued, "First Federal needs to issue a public apology, not a press release full of corporate jargon, but an honest acknowledgement of the harm done to customers like me. And most importantly, you need to commit to structural change that ensures this never happens again." Gregory cleared his throat. "Mrs. Wilkins, while I appreciate your perspective, personnel matters are handled through specific internal protocols. As for public statements, our communications team would need to carefully craft any—" "Let me be clear, Mr. Andrews," Vincent interjected. "What you're hearing aren't suggestions or requests. These are the minimum necessary steps to begin addressing the situation. The alternative is significantly less pleasant for First Federal. Is that a threat, Mr. Moretti? One of the lawyers asked. Vincent smiled thinly. It's a reality. The evidence we've gathered today would support not only individual complaints, but a class action lawsuit that could cost First Federal millions in settlements and incalculable damage to your reputation. And that's before considering potential regulatory penalties. Gregory's expression hardened. And if we agree to these immediate actions, then we move to the next phase. Comprehensive reform, Vincent replied. But accountability comes first. The people who created and enforced these discriminatory practices cannot be the ones to fix them. A tense silence filled the room as Gregory consulted quietly with his legal team. After several minutes of hushed conversation, he straightened his shoulders and addressed Eleanor directly. Mrs. Wilkins, I offer my sincere apology for your experience today. It's unacceptable and inconsistent with the values First Federal aspires to uphold. He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. Jason Reynolds will be terminated effective immediately. Diane Foster will be placed on administrative leave pending review. I will personally issue a public statement acknowledging what occurred and outlining our commitment to improvement. Eleanor nodded her expression, suggesting she recognized both the concession and the careful phrasing. However, Gregory continued, I must insist that any further actions be developed through proper channels with appropriate input from First Federal's leadership and board. Agreed, Vincent replied before Eleanor could respond. With one condition, the process must include independent oversight with community representation. Gregory's jaw tightened momentarily before he nodded. Acceptable, provided all parties sign appropriate confidentiality agreements. Vincent turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Wilkins, is this a sufficient starting point? Eleanor considered the question carefully. It's a start, she finally said. But only a start. The real test will be what happens next and whether it creates lasting change. With that qualified acceptance, the focus shifted to immediate implementation. Gregory instructed Thomas Whitfield to handle Jason's termination, while legal began drafting the necessary paperwork for Diane's administrative leave. James Wilson ensured all actions were properly documented to establish a record of compliance. As these wheels were set in motion, Vincent drew Eleanor aside. We've achieved the first objective, he said quietly. But as you noted, it's only the beginning. Are you prepared for what comes next? It may require significant time and commitment. Eleanor's expression was resolute. Mr. Moretti, I spent my youth fighting for the right to be treated with basic human dignity. I'm 73 now, and apparently that fight isn't finished. So, yes, I'm prepared however long it takes. Vincent nodded with respect. Then, let's ensure your voice remains central to this process. He paused, considering his next words carefully. There's something else we should discuss, your financial situation. I understand you've been saving for property taxes. That's my concern, Mr. Moretti, Eleanor replied firmly. I've managed my affairs for decades without assistance. Of course, Vincent acknowledged. I'm not suggesting charity. I'm proposing fair compensation for your expertise and time. If you'll be involved in reforming First Federal's practices, essentially consulting work, you should be paid accordingly. Eleanor considered this. I won't be bought, Mr. Moretti. I'm not trying to buy you, Mrs. Wilkins. I'm recognizing your value. Vincent's tone was sincere. Your knowledge of banking regulations, community needs, and lived experience is worth no less than any banking consultant's expertise, probably more. After a moment's contemplation, Eleanor nodded. As long as it's payment for work, not silence. I won't sign anything that prevents me from speaking the truth about what happened here. I wouldn't expect you to, Vincent assured her. Their conversation was interrupted as Gregory Andrews approached, his expression more genuine than it had been earlier. Mrs. Wilkins, Mr. Moretti, Jason Reynolds, has been informed of his termination. He's being escorted from the building now." The news brought a complex wave of emotions to Eleanor's face, not triumph, but a somber acknowledgement that accountability, while necessary, wasn't painless. "What did he say?" she asked, quietly. Gregory appeared surprised by the question. He expressed disbelief initially, then anger. He maintained he was simply following protocols. And was he? Eleanor pressed. Following protocols, Gregory's discomfort was visible. The protocols existed, yes, but his implementation was unnecessarily harsh in public. There were many ways to handle your transaction with dignity, regardless of any security concerns. So the system enabled his behavior, but his choices made it worse, Eleanor observed. That's important to understand for what comes next. Both need to change the systems and the people who implement them. As the day's events continued to unfold, the first concrete consequences had been established. Jason Reynolds, the face of First Federal's discrimination for Eleanor that morning, was gone. Diane Foster, who had enabled and reinforced the culture, was suspended. Gregory Andrews had been forced to acknowledge the problems publicly. It wasn't justice yet, but it was accountability. And for Eleanor Wilkins, who had entered the bank that morning simply hoping to deposit her savings, it represented something she hadn't felt in a long time when dealing with institutions like First Federal Power. The question now was how that initial accountability would translate into lasting transformation. By late afternoon, word of the dramatic events at First Federal's main branch had begun to spread. What had started as an isolated incident involving one elderly customer had expanded into a full-blown crisis for the bank's leadership. Several employees had recorded Jason Reynolds being escorted from the building, and social media was already buzzing with fragmented accounts of what had transpired. "We need to address this publicly," Vincent advised Gregory, "before the narrative forms without your input." Gregory nodded grimly. "My communications team is drafting a statement." "No," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "Not a carefully crafted statement released to the media. Real accountability requires facing those who were harmed." Gregory looked bewildered. "What exactly are you suggesting? A direct address to the customers and employees in the branch?" Eleanor clarified. "Right now, in the lobby where this all began." The bank president visibly balked at the suggestion. "That's highly unorthodox. Corporate communications are typically managed through proper channels, which is exactly why they're rarely believed." Vincent noted. "Mrs. Wilkins is right. This situation began with public humiliation in your lobby. The accountability should occur in the same space." After considerable resistance and consultation with his legal team, Gregory reluctantly agreed. The group made their way back to the main floor where business had continued despite the morning's disruption. As they entered the lobby, conversations quieted and heads turned. Word had clearly spread among the staff that something significant was happening. Thomas Whitfield quickly arranged for the bank's security to temporarily pause new customers from entering while allowing those already inside to complete their transactions. Employees gathered uncertainly, many exchanging concerned glances. Vincent observed the scene with satisfaction. The public nature of this moment was crucial not for humiliation, but for genuine accountability that couldn't be managed away behind closed doors. Gregory Andrews stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable but resigned to the necessity of the moment. He cleared his throat, and the lobby fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please," he began, his voice carrying across the marble expanse. "My name is Gregory Andrews, president of First Federal Bank. I'm here today because something happened in this branch this morning that was unacceptable and inconsistent with the values our institution claims to uphold." He gestured toward Eleanor, who stood dignified and composed beside Vincent. "Mrs. Eleanor Wilkins, a loyal customer of 30 years, came to this bank to make a simple transaction depositing money she had earned and saved to pay her property taxes. Instead of being treated with the respect and courtesy every customer deserves, she was subjected to questioning suspicion and public humiliation. A murmur rippled through the gathered employees and customers. What happened to Mrs. Wilkins was not an isolated incident. Gregory continued, visibly forcing himself to maintain eye contact with those assembled. It was the result of practices and policies that, when fully examined, reveal patterns of differential treatment based on factors that have no place in banking decisions, age, appearance, and, yes, race. The admission hung in the air, its bluntness surprising, given the typical corporate tendency toward euphemism and minimization. As a result of these findings, several immediate actions have been taken. Jason Reynolds, the account manager involved in this morning's incident, has been terminated. Diane Foster, the branch manager, has been placed on administrative leave, pending further review. The employees exchanged glances, many appearing shocked at the swift and public announcement of personnel decisions that would typically be handled discreetly. But individual actions are not sufficient. Gregory continued. We have discovered that First Federal has implemented practices that disproportionately impact elderly and minority customers. These practices are being suspended immediately, and a comprehensive review is underway. He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. I want to be clear, what happened here was wrong, not just in execution, but in concept. And the responsibility for that extends beyond any individual employee to leadership, including myself. The admission of personal responsibility was clearly difficult for a man who had spent decades carefully crafting his corporate image. Moving forward, First Federal will establish an independent oversight committee, including community representatives with genuine authority, to ensure equitable banking practices. We will review all policies and procedures to identify and eliminate discriminatory impacts, and we will provide comprehensive retraining for all staff. Gregory gestured toward Eleanor. Mrs. Wilkins has graciously agreed to assist in this process, bringing her perspective and experience to guide our efforts, but I would now like to offer her the opportunity to address you directly. Eleanor appeared momentarily surprised at being invited to speak. She stepped forward, her worn but polished shoes making a soft sound against the marble floor, the same floor where she had faced humiliation hours earlier. I came here this morning to make a simple deposit. She began, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. I've been a customer of this bank since 1989, when my late husband Walter and I opened our account. For many years we were treated with respect. The tellers knew our names. They asked about our family. They valued our business, modest though it was. She surveyed the faces, watching her bank employees, customers, security personnel, before continuing. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Not suddenly, but gradually. The personalized service became automated. The smiles became perfunctory. The respect became conditional based on how much money we had, how we dressed, what we looked like. Several employees lowered their gaze, perhaps recognizing uncomfortable truths in her words. What happened to me today wasn't just about one young man with poor judgment. It was about a culture that made his behavior acceptable, even rewarded. A culture that decided some people deserve dignity and others don't. Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she continued. I spent my youth fighting for basic civil rights. I marched. I registered voters. I advocated for fair housing. I never expected to still be fighting for the simple right to be treated with respect at 73. She turned slightly to address the bank employees directly. Many of you saw what happened this morning. Some looked away. Some pretended not to notice. A few, a brave few, have since spoken up. Change begins with those choices, the choice to see injustice, to name it, and to act. Eleanor then addressed the customers. And to those of you who bank here, who entrust your money to this institution, demand better. Your silence enables practices that harm your neighbors, your community members, perhaps even yourselves. Finally, she turned back to Gregory Andrews. Mr. Andrews, words and promises are necessary beginnings, but they remain just that, beginnings. The test will be an action sustained over time that demonstrate genuine commitment to treating all customers with equal dignity and respect. When Eleanor finished speaking, the lobby remained silent for several heartbeats. Then spontaneously, someone began to applaud. Others joined in, the sound echoing off the marble and glass until it filled the cavernous space. Acknowledgement, respect, and perhaps a touch of atonement. Gregory Andrews, recognizing the significance of the moment, extended his hand to Eleanor. "Mrs. Wilkins, on behalf of First Federal, I apologize for how you were treated today and commit to ensuring it never happens again." Eleanor accepted his handshake with dignity. "I'll be watching to make sure that commitment is honored, Mr. Andrews." As the public reckoning concluded and normal bank operations resumed, Vincent observed the impact of what had just occurred. The public acknowledgement had transformed an internal issue into a visible commitment that would be far harder to quietly abandon. Employees had witnessed leadership taking responsibility. Customers had seen accountability in action. Most importantly, Eleanor Wilkins had reclaimed not just her dignity, but her power, standing in the very space where it had been challenged and speaking truth that could no longer be denied. As they prepared to leave the bank, Vincent noticed Eleanor gazing thoughtfully around the lobby. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. "I'm thinking about Walter," she replied. "He always said institutions don't change because they want to. They change because they have to." Today, this one had to. Vincent nodded in agreement. The question now is how to ensure that change outlasts today's crisis. Eleanor's expression grew determined. "That's why the work isn't finished. Not even close." As they walked out through the heavy glass doors into the late afternoon sunlight, both knew that what had begun as a humiliating incident had transformed into the first step of a longer journey toward banking equality, one that would require continued vigilance, commitment, and courage to complete. 1 week after the confrontation at First Federal, Eleanor Wilkins found herself in an unexpected location, the 38th floor of a sleek downtown office building, seated across from Vincent Moretti in his private office. The space reflected its occupant, powerful but understated expensive, without being ostentatious and meticulously organized. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Wilkins," Vincent said, gesturing to the spectacular view of Chicago's skyline. "Different perspective up here, isn't it?" "In more ways than one," Eleanor replied, taking in the panorama that included both the gleaming towers of downtown and, in the distance, neighborhoods like her own. "Most people only see the city from one angle their entire lives." Vincent nodded appreciatively at her observation. "That's precisely why I asked you here today. Perspective matters especially when attempting meaningful change." He slid a leather portfolio across his desk. "This is a proposal for your consideration. Following our discussion last week about fair compensation for your expertise, I've outlined a potential role for you in the banking reform efforts at First Federal." Eleanor opened the portfolio cautiously, her expression growing increasingly surprised as she read the contents. "This is quite substantial. It reflects the value of your contribution," Vincent stated matter-of-factly. "Your knowledge of banking regulations, community needs, and lived experience is irreplaceable in this process." The proposal outlined a position as community banking consultant with significant compensation, official authority within the reform process, and administrative support to facilitate her work. It was far more substantial than the advisory role Eleanor had initially envisioned. "Mr. Moretti," she said carefully, "this is very generous, but I have concerns." "I'd expect nothing less," Vincent replied. "Please share them." Eleanor closed the portfolio. "First, while I appreciate the financial consideration, this seems excessive for someone with my background." "Your background is precisely why it's appropriate," Vincent countered. "Banking consultants with far less relevant expertise charge similar rates. Why should your knowledge be valued less because it comes from lived experience rather than an Ivy League degree?" Eleanor acknowledged the point with a slight nod, but continued. "My second concern is more significant. You're Vincent Moretti, Vincent raised an eyebrow, waiting for elaboration. I may be 73, but I read newspapers and listen to the radio, Eleanor explained. The Moretti family has a reputation in Chicago. Your legitimate businesses are well known, but so are the whispers about other activities. Vincent's expression remained impassive, though something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but a kind of respectful assessment. You're worried about the association, he observed. I'm worried about compromising the integrity of what we're trying to accomplish, Eleanor clarified. Banking reform is already difficult enough without giving critics reason to dismiss it as influenced by questionable interests. Vincent leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before responding. Mrs. Wilkins, I appreciate your directness. It's refreshing in a world where most people dance around uncomfortable truths. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city before continuing. My family's history in Chicago is complex, as is my current position. I won't insult your intelligence by denying that the Moretti name carries certain connotations. Turning back to face her, he continued. But I can tell you this with complete honesty. My interest in First Federal's reform is legitimate. My grandmother's experience as a housekeeper showed me how institutions can diminish human dignity through 1,000 small cuts. What I witnessed happening to you triggered memories I couldn't ignore. That explains your initial intervention, Eleanor acknowledged. But this ongoing involvement, this significant financial investment in the reform process, what motivates that? Vincent considered the question carefully. Part of it is practical. I have business interests connected to First Federal that benefit from a stable, well-functioning institution. Part is personal, my grandmother's voice in my head reminding me that power without purpose is wasted. He returned to his seat, meeting Eleanor's gaze directly. But if you're asking whether this is part of some elaborate scheme to gain leverage over the bank for illegitimate purposes, no. Banking is already corrupt enough without my help, Mrs. Wilkins. The dry observation drew an unexpected smile from Eleanor. That's certainly true. Here's what I propose, Vincent continued. Your role and compensation remain as outlined, but you maintain complete independence. Your primary accountability is to the community, not to me. I'll provide resources and access, but your voice and decisions remain your own. He reached into a drawer and produced a second document. This formally establishes the Banking Equality Initiative as an independent entity. It will be funded for 3 years, regardless of whether you accept the position. The Oversight Committee will include community representatives selected without my input. And everything will be structured to ensure transparency and legitimacy. Eleanor took the document, scanning it thoughtfully. You've given this considerable thought. I don't enter commitments lightly, Mrs. Wilkins, Vincent replied. Nor, I suspect, do you. Eleanor sat in contemplative silence for several moments. I would need complete freedom to speak the truth as I see it, even if that truth is uncomfortable for First Federal or for you. I wouldn't expect anything less, Vincent assured her, and any hint of improper influence or pressure would end my involvement immediately, she added firmly. Agreed? Vincent nodded. Eleanor took a deep breath. Then I accept with one condition of my own, which is, the initiative needs to extend beyond First Federal. Eleanor stated, what we discovered isn't isolated to one bank. The patterns exist throughout the financial industry. If we're truly committed to change, it has to be broader. Vincent smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his typically guarded features. Mrs. Wilkins, I was hoping you would say exactly that. Over the next hour, they refined the details of Eleanor's role and the initiative's structure. The arrangement they crafted balanced Vincent's resources and influence with Eleanor's independence and community connection. It wasn't a traditional corporate reform effort, it was something potentially more powerful. As their meeting concluded, Vincent walked Eleanor to the elevator. There's one more thing, he said. I've arranged for a car service to be available to you. Given your new responsibilities, walking 3 miles to appointments seems an unnecessary burden." Eleanor appeared ready to refuse, then reconsidered. "My arthritis has been worse lately," she acknowledged. "But the car comes with the position not as personal charity." Of course, Vincent agreed, respecting her need to maintain dignity and independence, even in accepting assistance. As the elevator doors opened, Eleanor turned to him with an expression of quiet determination. "Mr. Moretti, I've spent decades being underestimated because of how I look where I live and what I do for a living. I won't waste this opportunity." "I never thought you would," Vincent replied with genuine respect. "That's exactly why you're the right person for this role." As Eleanor departed, Vincent returned to his office, reflecting on the unexpected alliance that had formed. Eleanor Wilkins brought moral authority, lived experience, and grassroots connection. He contributed resources, access, and strategic influence. Together, they might accomplish what neither could achieve alone. What had begun as a spontaneous intervention in a bank lobby was evolving into something with the potential for lasting impact, not just for one elderly customer, but for countless others who faced similar discrimination every day. Vincent Moretti had built his reputation on recognizing opportunity where others saw only problems. And in Eleanor Wilkins he recognized something rare and valuable, a partner who measured wealth not in dollars, but in dignity. 3 months after the confrontation at First Federal's main branch, the impact of that day's events had expanded far beyond what anyone might have predicted. The Banking Equality Initiative, formally established with Eleanor Wilkins as its public face and Vincent Moretti as its powerful but discreet backer, had catalyzed changes throughout First Federal's Chicago operations and begun to influence the broader banking community. On a bright Tuesday morning, not unlike the day Eleanor had first entered the bank with her savings, a very different scene unfolded in First Federal's main lobby. The physical space remained impressive with its marble floors and soaring ceilings, but subtle changes were evident to the observant eye. New signage explained transaction procedures in multiple languages. Customer service representatives now wore badges indicating which languages they spoke. The previously intimidating teller counters had been partially replaced by more accessible service areas where customers could sit rather than stand during transactions. Most significantly, the staff reflected a diversity previously absent. Among them was Darius Hamilton, an African-American man in his mid-30s who had replaced Jason Reynolds. With advanced degrees in finance and 6 years of community banking experience, Darius brought both professional qualifications and personal commitment to equitable banking practices. Eleanor observed these changes with satisfaction as she entered the bank for the quarterly review meeting of the Community Oversight Committee. She was no longer an anonymous customer, but a recognized figure whose presence commanded respect not because of wealth or status, but because of the moral authority she had earned. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilkins." Lucia Hernandez greeted her warmly, no longer a nervous teller afraid to speak up. Lucia had been promoted to Customer Experience Manager following Diane Foster's eventual resignation. "The committee members are gathering in Conference Room A." "Thank you, Lucia," Eleanor replied. "How is the new training program going?" "Much better than expected," Lucia reported. "Even some of the more resistant staff are starting to understand why these changes matter. The customer testimonials have been especially powerful." Eleanor nodded approvingly. The decision to include actual customer experiences in the training materials, letting employees hear directly from those who had faced discrimination, had been her suggestion. Numbers and policies could be dismissed. Human stories could not. The committee meeting brought together an unusual Assembly Bank executives, including Thomas Whitfield, now on probationary status, community representatives from diverse Chicago neighborhoods, financial inclusion experts, and Eleanor herself. Vincent Moretti was not present by design. He remained in the background, allowing the initiative to establish its own legitimacy. Gregory Andrews joined via video conference, his initial reluctance now transformed into what appeared to be genuine engagement. Whether from conviction or pragmatism, the bank president had become an advocate for reforms that were showing measurable business benefits alongside their ethical value. The quarterly numbers are in. Gregory reported to the committee. Customer satisfaction scores have increased by 22% across all Chicago branches. New account openings are up 17%, with the most significant growth in previously underserved communities. More importantly, Eleanor added, complaint filings have decreased by 68%, and our community feedback sessions show meaningful improvement in how customers feel they're treated. The transformation had not been without resistance. Several long-term employees had resigned rather than adapt to new expectations. Others had required intensive retraining to overcome ingrained behaviors and assumptions. But the changes had taken root, reinforced by revised policies, accountability measures, and a compensation structure that rewarded inclusive service rather than account size. Key reforms implemented over the 3 months included comprehensive policy review, eliminating the customer coding system and replacing it with transparent service standards applied equally to all customers. Revised training for all customer-facing staff, including modules on unconscious bias and cultural competence developed with community input. New hiring practices that prioritize diversity at all levels of the organization with particular emphasis on management positions. Modified branch evaluation metrics that valued community engagement and customer retention alongside traditional financial performance measures. Creation of a streamlined complaint process with independent review and meaningful consequences for verified instances of discrimination. Community Investment Fund, directing resources to financial literacy programs and small business support in underserved neighborhoods. Quarterly public reporting on service equity metrics and progress toward inclusion goals. Perhaps most significantly, First Federal had implemented a formal restitution program for customers who had experienced discriminatory treatment. Through careful analysis of transaction records, fee histories, and service patterns, the bank had identified numerous cases where customers had been charged excessive fees, denied services, or otherwise treated unfairly based on demographic factors. To date, we've processed 342 restitution cases, Thomas Whitfield reported during the meeting. The total financial impact exceeds $1.2 million when accounting for fees, interest, and compensatory adjustments. And how many of these customers have chosen to maintain their relationship with First Federal? Eleanor inquired. Approximately 78%, Thomas replied, which is significantly higher than we anticipated. People value acknowledgement and correction more than perfection, Eleanor observed. When institutions admit mistakes and make meaningful amends, trust can be rebuilt. The meeting continued with discussions of ongoing challenges and next phase initiatives. The committee had evolved from initial skepticism into a collaborative body with genuine authority, a model that other banks were beginning to notice and in some cases emulate. As the formal session concluded, Gregory Andrews addressed Eleanor directly through the video link. Mrs. Wilkins, I wanted to share something with you. The Board of Directors has unanimously approved the Wilkins Standards as official policy across all First Federal operations nationwide. Eleanor appeared genuinely surprised. I wasn't aware my name was being attached to the standards. The board felt it was appropriate, Gregory explained. Your advocacy has fundamentally changed how we approach customer service. These aren't just policy adjustments, they represent a philosophical shift in how we define banking relationships. Eleanor accepted the recognition with characteristic dignity, though those who knew her well could see the emotion behind her composed exterior. For a woman who had spent decades being overlooked and undervalued, having her name attached to institutional standards of respect and equality held profound significance. After the meeting, Eleanor walked through the bank lobby with Lucia observing the day-to-day implementation of the changes they had helped create. They paused near the teller window where 3 months earlier Jason Reynolds had humiliated Eleanor in front of waiting customers. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed," Lucia commented. "I used to dread coming to work, knowing I was part of a system that treated people unfairly but feeling powerless to change it." "That's how injustice persists," Eleanor replied. "Not just through those who actively discriminate, but through the silence of those who recognize the wrong but believe they can't challenge it. What you did that day, standing your ground with dignity even when you were being mistreated, it changed everything," Lucia said. "Not just for this bank, but for all of us who were watching." Eleanor smiled softly. "I had help," she acknowledged, thinking of Vincent's timely intervention. "But you're right, that change begins with individual choices, the choice to maintain dignity when others try to diminish it, and the choice to speak truth even when silence seems safer." As they continued their tour, Eleanor noticed a new customer, an elderly Hispanic woman being welcomed and assisted by Darius with evident respect and patience. The woman was completing a transaction similar to Eleanor's 3 months earlier, depositing cash savings accumulated over time. But her experience could not have been more different. That, Eleanor said quietly, gesturing toward the interaction, is what real change looks like. Not just written policies or public statements, but transformed daily experiences. Later that afternoon, Eleanor met with Vincent at a small cafe several blocks from the bank. These regular but discreet meetings allowed them to maintain their strategic partnership while preserving Eleanor's independent public role. The quarterly review was encouraging. Eleanor reported sharing the highlights of the committee meeting. Vincent listened attentively, asking occasional questions that revealed his genuine engagement with the details. Despite his background and reputation, Eleanor had discovered that Vincent Moretti possessed both unexpected depth and sincere commitment to the initiative they had created together. "The Wilkins Standards," Vincent noted with appreciation. "Well-deserved recognition." Eleanor dismissed the compliment with a small wave. Names matter less than implementation. The question is whether these changes will outlast current attention and pressure. That's why the 3-year funding commitment matters, Vincent reminded her. Sustained oversight is built into the structure. Still, Eleanor persisted. What happens in branches outside Chicago? What about other banks watching to see if this blows over? Institutional memory is short when it comes to reform. Vincent studied her with respect. Most people would have been satisfied, even celebratory, about the progress already achieved. Eleanor's focus on long-term, widespread change revealed the depth of her commitment. "You're thinking beyond First Federal," he observed. "I'm thinking about every elderly person who gets questioned when withdrawing their own money," Eleanor replied. "Every minority customer who faces extra scrutiny for routine transactions. Every low-income family treated as suspicious rather than valuable. The problem never was just one bank or one teller." Vincent nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps it's time to expand our focus. The Banking Equality Initiative was always designed to extend beyond First Federal. The question is how," Eleanor said. "Regulations already exist prohibiting discrimination. Forms get filed, reports get generated, but practices persist. Because consequences are insufficient," Vincent noted. "Fines become just another cost of doing business." "What changes behavior is visibility and reputation," Eleanor suggested. "If banks competed on equitable service the way they compete on interest rates or mobile features, we might see genuine transformation." Vincent's expression shifted as an idea took shape. An equity rating system he proposed, independent assessment and public ranking of how banks actually treat customers across demographic categories, combined with community certification that has real market value. Eleanor added, building on the concept. Not just regulatory compliance, but verified equity excellence that customers recognize and seek out. As they continued developing this expansion of their initiative, the partnership between Eleanor Wilkins and Vincent Moretti demonstrated its unique strength, combining her moral clarity and lived experience with his strategic thinking and resource access to create change neither could achieve alone. The transformation that had begun with one woman's humiliation in a bank lobby was expanding into something with the potential to reshape banking practices far beyond First Federal's marble halls. The changes at First Federal Bank had profound professional implications, but for Eleanor Wilkins, the personal impact of the past 3 months had been equally significant. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Eleanor hosted a small gathering in her modest South Side home, something that would have been unimaginable just a few months earlier. Her living room, always clean but showing the inevitable wear of a house nearly 5 decades old, had undergone subtle transformations. The roof no longer leaked when it rained. The ancient furnace had been replaced with an efficient new system. The cracked windows that had let in winter drafts were now tight and weatherproof. These improvements weren't luxuries, but necessities that Eleanor's limited income had previously forced her to defer. Around her small dining table sat 4 women Eleanor had known for decades, her neighborhood friends who had shared life's joys and sorrows through marriages, children, grandchildren, retirements, and widowhood. They had always been close, but today's conversation revealed a shift in how they viewed their longtime friend. "I still can't believe it when I see you on the news," remarked Harriet Jenkins, who had lived 3 doors down for 30 years. "My friend Eleanor speaking at banking conferences and giving interviews." Eleanor smiled as she poured tea into mismatched cups that had been wedding gifts half a century earlier. "Trust me, no one is more surprised than I am." "You shouldn't be surprised," countered Dorothy Williams, who had taught elementary school until her retirement. "You've always been the smartest one among us. The difference is, now other people are finally noticing." The women laughed, but beneath the humor lay genuine pride in Eleanor's unexpected emergence as an advocate for banking equality. These friends had witnessed her struggles over decades, working multiple cleaning jobs to make ends meet after Walter's death, scrimping to maintain her home, facing dismissive treatment from institutions that saw only her age and appearance rather than her intelligence and dignity. "The bank manager actually called me by name last week." Ruth Martinez shared, shaking her head in disbelief. "Asked how my grandson's college applications were going. I've banked there for 20 years, and this is the first time anyone's remembered a personal detail." "That's what this is really about," Eleanor replied, setting down her teacup. "Not just policies or procedures, but being seen as fully human, worthy of basic courtesy regardless of how much money you have." "Well, I'm just glad you're getting properly paid for all this work," Harriet noted. "You spent too many years breaking your back for too little." It was true. The compensation Eleanor received as a banking consultant had transformed her financial reality. After decades of precarious living, counting every dollar and sacrificing necessities, she now experienced the profound relief of economic security. Her property taxes were paid well in advance. Her modest savings account grew steadily. She could afford her medications without cutting pills in half to make them last longer. But beyond material improvements, Eleanor experienced a deeper transformation, the recognition of her knowledge and wisdom as valuable. After decades of being dismissed or overlooked, her voice now commanded attention in boardrooms and conferences. Her lived experience was acknowledged as expertise rather than dismissed as anecdotal. This shift extended to her relationship with Lucia Hernandez and Alexis Torres, the young bankers who had risked their positions to speak truth during the initial confrontation. Both women now sought Eleanor's mentorship, recognizing in her not just moral courage, but strategic wisdom developed through decades of navigating unjust systems. "I never thought I'd be teaching banking professionals at my age," Eleanor confided to her friends. "But those young women remind me of myself at their age, full of determination to make things right, but needing guidance on how to work within institutions while changing them." As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor's friends gradually departed with warm hugs and promises to meet again soon. When the last guest had gone, Eleanor sat quietly in her living room, surrounded by the photographs that chronicled her life with Walter. His image smiled at her from their wedding day, from vacations they'd saved years to take from the community garden they'd tended together. "You should see what's happening, Walter," she said softly to his photograph. "All those years you served on that banking advisory board, trying to make them listen. They're finally listening now." The silence that answered held the familiar ache of his absence, but also a sense of continuing his work, their shared commitment to dignity and justice that had defined their life together. Eleanor's reflective moment was interrupted by her phone ringing a new smartphone that had replaced her ancient landline. The caller was Vincent Moretti, checking in before his trip to New York, where he would meet with financial regulators about expanding the Banking Equality Initiative. "Everything is prepared for Tuesday's community forum," Eleanor reported after they exchanged greetings. "We have confirmed attendance from representatives of 3 other banks who are interested in implementing similar reforms." "Excellent," Vincent replied. "The momentum is building faster than I anticipated." Their conversation turned to strategic matters, upcoming presentations, policy proposals, community feedback mechanisms. What had begun as an unlikely partnership had evolved into a productive collaboration built on mutual respect. Vincent valued Eleanor's moral clarity and community connection. Eleanor appreciated his strategic thinking and willingness to use his influence for meaningful change. Neither spoke directly about the unusual nature of their alliance, an elderly former housekeeper and a powerful businessman with a controversial reputation, but both recognized that their partnership worked precisely because of their differences, rather than despite them. After completing their business discussion, Vincent hesitated before adding, "My grandmother has asked to meet you." The request surprised Eleanor. Vincent rarely spoke of his personal life, though he had mentioned his grandmother Sophia during their first encounter at the bank. "She's heard me speak of your work," Vincent continued. "She says you remind her of herself, though she uses considerably more colorful language to express it." Eleanor smiled at the thought. "I'd be honored to meet her. She's 92 and doesn't leave home often," Vincent explained. "Would you be comfortable visiting her at my family home next weekend? I can send a car." "Of course." Eleanor agreed, curious about the woman who had shaped Vincent's values. After they concluded their call, Eleanor reflected on how profoundly her life had changed in 3 short months. From the humiliation in First Federal's lobby to becoming the public face of banking reform, from financial insecurity to economic stability, from invisibility to influence, the transformation seemed almost unbelievable. Yet Eleanor remained grounded in the reality of ongoing challenges. Despite significant progress, resistance to change persisted. Some bank executives still viewed equity initiatives as public relations exercises rather than fundamental reforms. Some employees still treated certain customers differently, despite new policies. The work remained unfinished. But for the first time in years, Eleanor felt genuinely hopeful. Not just for herself, but for the countless others who faced similar discrimination every day. Something had shifted not just in banking practices, but in public expectations. People were beginning to demand dignity as a right, rather than accepting disrespect as inevitable. The following weekend, Eleanor found herself being driven to an elegant North Shore estate, the Moretti family home where Vincent had grown up under his grandmother's care. The driver escorted her to a sunroom overlooking immaculate gardens, where an elderly woman sat regally in a comfortable chair. Sophia Moretti might have been in her 90s, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing as she assessed Eleanor with immediate approval. "So, you're the one who stood up to those banking fools," she said without preamble, her Italian accent still pronounced after decades in America. "About time someone showed them they can't treat people like garbage." Eleanor liked her immediately. It took longer than it should have. "Everything worthwhile does," Sophia replied with a dismissive wave. "Vincent tells me you cleaned houses for 50 years. Me too. Broke my back scrubbing floors for people who couldn't be bothered to learn my name." What followed was a remarkable conversation between 2 women from different worlds who shared common experiences. The dignity of hard work regardless of status, the frustration of being underestimated, the quiet determination to ensure their children and grandchildren would face fewer barriers. "You taught Vincent well," Eleanor observed as their visit drew to a close. Sophia snorted. He was a stubborn boy, always asking why things were the way they were, why some people had everything and others nothing, why his friends' mothers didn't have calloused hands like mine. She looked out toward the garden, her expression softening slightly. "I told him power is like water. It can nourish or it can drown. The choice is in how you direct it." As Eleanor departed, Sophia clasped her hand with surprising strength. "What you're doing making those banks treat people like human beings that matters. Don't stop until it's finished." "I won't." Eleanor promised, recognizing in Sophia's fierce determination the source of Vincent's commitment to their shared cause. The meeting reinforced Eleanor's understanding that personal transformation often preceded broader social change. Her own journey from victim to advocate had catalyzed institutional reforms. Vincent's early lessons from his grandmother had shaped his use of influence decades later. Lucia and Alexis finding their voices had inspired other bank employees to speak up. As Eleanor returned home that evening, she reflected on the unlikely chain of events that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as a humiliating experience had ultimately led to renewed purpose, unexpected alliances, and the opportunity to create lasting change. The journey wasn't completed, perhaps it never would be fully finished. But Eleanor Wilkins, at 73, had discovered that age brought not just wisdom, but the hard-earned authority to insist on justice too long denied. Her personal transformation had become a powerful catalyst for change that extended far beyond her individual experience, touching lives throughout Chicago and beyond. 1 year after Eleanor Wilkins had stood trembling with humiliation in First Federal's lobby, she returned for a very different purpose. The bank was hosting the Chicago Financial Inclusion Summit, an event that would have been unimaginable 12 months earlier. Representatives from banks across the region had gathered to learn about First Federal's transformation and the banking equality initiative that had spread to 17 other financial institutions. Eleanor, now a recognized figure in banking reform circles, was scheduled to deliver the keynote address. As she reviewed her notes in a quiet corner of the executive suite, a space she now entered with confidence rather than intimidation, she noticed a familiar face across the room. Jason Reynolds, the former account manager whose discriminatory treatment had catalyzed the entire movement, stood awkwardly near the refreshment table. He looked different, the slick confidence replaced by evident discomfort as he surveyed the room full of banking executives and community leaders. Eleanor observed him without immediate reaction. After his termination, Jason had struggled to find comparable employment, his dismissal for discriminatory conduct following him through Chicago's close-knit banking community. According to Lucia's occasional updates, he had eventually found work at a small credit union in a neighboring state in a more junior position than he had held at First Federal. His presence at today's summit was unexpected. Eleanor considered avoiding the encounter, focusing instead on her upcoming presentation. But after a moment's reflection, she decided on a different approach. Setting aside her notes, she walked directly toward him. Jason saw her coming and, visibly tensed, clearly contemplating retreat but finding no graceful escape route. When Eleanor stopped before him, he struggled to meet her gaze. "Mrs. Wilkins," he acknowledged stiffly. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I work here now," Eleanor replied evenly. "The question is why you're here, Mr. Reynolds." Jason shifted uncomfortably. "My current employer sent me. They're considering implementing some of First Federal's reforms." He hesitated before adding, "I've been assigned to their equity team." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, skepticism evident in her expression. "It's true," Jason insisted, his composure cracking slightly. "After what happened, after what I did, finding another position wasn't easy. When Liberty Credit Union finally hired me, they made it conditional on completing their ethics training program. He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. The program facilitator had us study cases of discriminatory banking. Mine was one of them, though they didn't know I was the banker in question. That must have been uncomfortable. Eleanor observed her tone neutral. It was humiliating, Jason admitted. Hearing my actions dissected, understanding for the first time how it felt from your perspective. He trailed off before continuing more quietly. I've spent a year thinking about that day. About how easily I dismissed you based on nothing but appearances. About the assumptions I made without a second thought. Eleanor studied him carefully, looking for signs of performance rather than genuine reflection. What she saw was a man significantly changed from the arrogant young banker who had humiliated her a year earlier. Are you asking for forgiveness? Mr. Reynolds, she asked directly. Jason shook his head. No. I don't expect that. I just wanted you to know that what happened changed me too. Not in the same way I can't compare my experience to yours, but it forced me to see things I'd been blind to before. Before Eleanor could respond, Gregory Andrews approached, his expression tightening when he recognized Jason. Mr. Reynolds, the bank president, said coldly, I wasn't aware you were on the attendee list. I'm here representing Liberty Credit Union. Jason explained his discomfort, increasing under Gregory's scrutiny. Perhaps it would be better if you, Gregory, began. It's fine, Eleanor interrupted. Mr. Reynolds and I were having a constructive conversation. She turned back to Jason. You said you're on their equity team. Jason nodded. Junior member, mostly implementing policies others develop. Eleanor considered this information thoughtfully before responding. Redemption isn't found in words, Mr. Reynolds. It's built through consistent actions that demonstrate genuine change. She reached into her portfolio and extracted a business card. The Banking Equality Initiative is developing a mentorship program for financial professionals committed to equitable practices. If you're serious about transformation rather than just rehabilitation of your career, contact this office. They'll assess whether you're ready to contribute meaningfully. Jason accepted the card with evident surprise. You'd be willing to give me that chance? After what I did, this was never about punishing individuals. Eleanor replied. It's about changing a culture. True change includes creating paths for people to learn and improve, even those who caused harm. As Jason absorbed her words, Vincent Moretti approached his presence immediately, commanding attention despite his deliberately understated demeanor. Mrs. Wilkins, they're ready for your keynote? Vincent informed her, his gaze flicking briefly to Jason with cool assessment. Thank you, Mr. Moretti. I'll be right there. Eleanor turned back to Jason. What you do with that card is your choice, Mr. Reynolds. Real change is difficult and uncomfortable. It requires more than regret. It demands sustained commitment. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jason holding the card like an uncertain promise. As she moved toward the presentation area with Vincent, he glanced back at her former antagonist. That was generous, Vincent observed. Not everyone would offer him a second chance. It wasn't generosity, Eleanor corrected. It was strategy. Transformed opponents become powerful advocates. If he's truly changed, his experience could help others recognize their own biases. Vincent nodded appreciatively. And if he hasn't? Then the mentorship program will identify that quickly. Eleanor replied pragmatically. I'm offering an opportunity, not a guarantee. As they reached the stage area, Vincent touched her arm lightly. You continue to surprise me, Mrs. Wilkins. Good, Eleanor replied with a small smile. Predictability is vastly overrated at my age. Taking her place at the podium, Eleanor surveyed the gathered financial leaders. 1 year earlier, most wouldn't have recognized her name or valued her perspective. Today, they had come specifically to hear her speak about transforming banking culture. The journey from humiliation to influence had been unexpected and profound. But as Eleanor began her address, she focused not on past injuries, but on future possibilities, a banking system that recognized the humanity in every customer, regardless of appearance, age, or account balance. The personal confrontation with Jason Reynolds had provided unexpected closure. But Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on the larger goal structural transformation that would endure long after today's summit concluded. 6 weeks after the Chicago Financial Inclusion Summit, Eleanor Wilkins stood in line at First Federal's main branch, patiently waiting her turn for a routine transaction. Though she now had access to the executive suite and private banking services, she deliberately chose to use the regular customer channels, providing first-hand observation of how reforms were being implemented in day-to-day operations. The bank lobby had undergone subtle but significant changes over the past year. Beyond physical renovations, the atmosphere itself had transformed. Customers from diverse backgrounds moved through the space with confidence rather than apprehension. Staff interacted with genuine attentiveness instead of perfunctory efficiency. Small details from multilingual signage to accessible seating areas communicated inclusion rather than intimidation. When Eleanor reached the front of the line, she was greeted by a young teller she hadn't met before, evidence of the significant staff turnover and expansion that had accompanied First Federal's reforms. "Good morning," the young woman said with a genuine smile. "How can I help you today? I'd like to make a cash deposit." Eleanor replied deliberately, echoing her request from a year earlier as she placed an envelope containing $3,500 on the counter. The teller, whose name tag read Amara Wilson, accepted the envelope professionally. "I'd be happy to help you with that deposit. May I see your ID and account card?" Eleanor provided her identification, watching carefully as Amara processed the transaction with respectful efficiency. There was no suspicion, no inappropriate questions about the source of funds, no differential treatment, just professional service delivered with basic human courtesy. "Would you like a printed receipt, Mrs. Wilkins?" Amara asked after completing the deposit. "Yes, please," Eleanor replied. As Amara printed the receipt, a flicker of recognition crossed her features. "Mrs. Wilkins," she said, her tone shifting slightly. "Are you the Mrs. Wilkins? The one who started the Banking Equality Initiative?" Eleanor nodded, curious about the young woman's reaction. Amara's professional composure momentarily gave way to genuine emotion. "It's an honor to meet you, ma'am. You're the reason I'm here." "How so?" Eleanor asked. "I'm part of the first cohort of the Community Banking Apprenticeship Program," Amara explained, referencing one of the initiative's workforce development projects. "Before this, I was working retail at minimum wage, even though I had an associate's degree in business. Traditional banks weren't hiring people from my neighborhood. The program had been designed specifically to create pathways to financial careers for residents of underserved communities, combining education with practical training and guaranteed job placement." "How are you finding it?" Eleanor inquired. "Life-changing," Amara replied without hesitation. "The training, the mentorship, the opportunity to build a real career. It's opened doors I couldn't even approach before." As they spoke, Eleanor noticed other customers listening with interest. A woman in line behind her stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you the lady from the poster?" She gestured toward a framed photograph on the wall that Eleanor had deliberately avoided looking at directly. There, alongside images of community leaders and banking pioneers, hung a portrait of Eleanor Wilkins with a simple caption, "Banking is a human right, not a privilege." Eleanor nodded, somewhat embarrassed by the attention, but recognizing its symbolic importance. Her image in that lobby, where she had once been humiliated and dismissed, represented a profound shift in what banking could and should be. Other customers began to approach, some sharing their own experiences of improved service, others expressing gratitude for specific reforms, like the elimination of predatory fees or the introduction of accessible banking options. An elderly man described how the new outreach program had helped him access benefits he hadn't known he qualified for. A young mother explained how the modified loan program had made her first home purchase possible. As the impromptu gathering grew, Darius Hamilton, who had replaced Jason Reynolds as account manager, approached with a warm smile. "Mrs. Wilkins," he greeted her. "I see you're experiencing the Eleanor effect again." "The what?" she asked, puzzled. "That's what we call it when customers recognize you and spontaneously start sharing their banking experiences," Darius explained. "It happens every time you visit a branch. People feel safe telling their stories when they see you." Eleanor hadn't realized her presence had such an impact. She had been focused on formal reforms policies, training accountability structures. But this organic community response revealed something equally significant: a restored trust that had been damaged through years of discriminatory practices. As the gathering dispersed and normal business resumed, Eleanor completed her transaction and prepared to leave. Near the exit, she noticed Vincent Moretti observing quietly from a discreet distance. It was the first time she had seen him in the public banking hall rather than the executive suites. "Checking on your investment?" Eleanor asked as she approached him. Observing its impact, Vincent corrected. "I was curious to see how things functioned when you visited as a regular customer." "The Eleanor effect?" she asked with a raised eyebrow. Vincent's mouth quirked in a rare display of amusement. An apt description. "Your presence changes the dynamic, reminds everyone why this matters." They walked together toward the door, an unlikely pair that no longer drew curious glances. Their partnership had become known, if not fully understood, throughout Chicago's financial community. "We've made real progress," Vincent observed, "but there's still resistance in some quarters." "Change is never complete," Eleanor replied. "It's sustained through vigilance and commitment. That's why the permanent oversight structures are essential." As they stepped outside into the bright afternoon, Eleanor paused to look back at the bank building. 1 year earlier, she had left that same doorway in tears, clutching her rejected money, her dignity in tatters. Today, she departed as a respected advocate whose work had transformed not just First Federal, but banking practices across the city. "Full circle," she murmured. Vincent followed her gaze, understanding the significance of the moment. "Not a circle," he corrected gently. "A spiral. We return to similar points but at a different level. That's how real progress works." Eleanor nodded, appreciating the distinction. The journey hadn't ended where it began. It had transcended its origins, creating new possibilities, not just for her, but for countless others who would never know the humiliation she had endured. As they walked toward Vincent's waiting car, Eleanor reflected on the power of dignity, how its denial had sparked a movement and how its restoration had transformed an institution. The Banking Equality Initiative would continue to evolve, facing new challenges and opportunities. But its foundation remained unshaken, the simple revolutionary principle that every person deserves respect regardless of appearance, age, or economic status. What had begun as one woman's humiliation had become a catalyst for lasting change-proof that sometimes justice arrives in unexpected forms, even in the marble lobbies of powerful institutions. 18 months after the confrontation at First Federal Bank, Eleanor Wilkins stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing the National Conference on Financial Inclusion. Before her sat representatives from banks, credit unions, regulatory agencies, and community organizations from across the country, all gathered to learn about the transformation that had begun in Chicago and spread to financial institutions in 23 states. The Wilkins Fair banking standards are not revolutionary, Eleanor stated, her voice strong despite her 75 years. They simply codify what should have been fundamental all along, that banking is a service for all people, not a privilege for some. The standards, now implemented by over 40 financial institutions nationwide, established clear metrics for equitable service, transparent fee structures, community investment, and workforce diversity. What had begun as reforms at a single Chicago bank had evolved into a movement changing how financial services were delivered to communities that had historically faced discrimination. True change isn't measured in policies or press releases, Eleanor continued. It's measured in daily experiences. The elderly customer who can access her savings without suspicion, the young family approved for their first mortgage, despite generations of redlining, the small business owner who finds support rather than obstacles in building community wealth. As Eleanor spoke, she noted Vincent Moretti sitting quietly in the back row. Unlike the banking executives and government officials occupying prominent positions, Vincent had deliberately chosen an unobtrusive seat, consistent with his approach throughout their partnership. His influence remained powerful but largely unseen, allowing the initiative to develop its own legitimacy, separate from his controversial reputation. Their unique collaboration had proven remarkably effective. Eleanor brought moral authority, lived experience, and community trust. Vincent contributed strategic thinking, resource access, and behind-the-scenes leverage when institutional resistance emerged. Together, they had created change neither could have achieved alone. Banking equity isn't charity, Eleanor emphasized, concluding her address. It's good business. Institutions implementing these standards have seen increased customer acquisition, improved retention, and stronger community relationships. Doing the right thing and doing the profitable thing can be the same thing when we expand our vision beyond short-term metrics. The evidence supported her assertion. First, Federal's transformation had produced measurable business benefits alongside its social impact. New accounts from previously underserved communities increased customer loyalty, positive media coverage, and improved regulatory relationships. Other financial institutions had noticed these outcomes, motivating their interest in adopting similar reforms. After her speech concluded and the appreciative applause faded, Eleanor found herself surrounded by attendees eager to discuss implementation strategies, community partnerships, and workforce development programs. Among them was Jason Reynolds, who had indeed followed through on contacting the mentorship program and now worked with a regional bank's equity team using his first-hand experience with discrimination to help others recognize and address their biases. "Your speech was powerful," Mrs. Wilkins, Jason said, when he finally had a moment to approach her. "Especially the part about transformation being possible for both individuals and institutions." Eleanor nodded, noting the genuine change in the young man who had once dismissed her so casually. "Redemption requires more than regret," she replied. "It demands consistent action that demonstrates genuine change. You seem to be on that path." "I'm trying," Jason acknowledged. "It's not always comfortable confronting these issues, especially when I was once part of the problem, but that discomfort serves a purpose." "Growth rarely happens in comfort zones," Eleanor observed, "for people or for institutions." As the conference continued, Eleanor participated in panel discussions and working groups sharing practical insights from the Banking Equality Initiative's implementation. Throughout these sessions, she emphasized that sustainable change required structural reforms rather than superficial adjustments, transformed policies, practices, incentives, and culture. That evening, she joined Vincent for dinner at a quiet restaurant near the conference center. Though their public association was now known, they maintained a professional discretion about their working relationship. "You were impressive today," Vincent noted as they reviewed the conference outcomes. "The initiative has developed a momentum beyond what either of us anticipated, because it addresses a need that existed long before we recognized it," Eleanor replied. "People have been waiting for banking to acknowledge their humanity, not just their account balances." Their conversation turned to strategic matters, expanding the certification program, strengthening accountability mechanisms, addressing emerging resistance from traditional banking interests. Despite significant progress, challenges remained, particularly from institutions that viewed equity reforms as unnecessary regulatory burdens rather than fundamental ethical obligations. "The work isn't finished," Eleanor observed, echoing a sentiment she had expressed throughout their partnership. Perhaps it never will be completely done. Most worthwhile endeavors aren't, Vincent replied. But that doesn't diminish their value. As their meal concluded, Vincent handed Eleanor an envelope. The quarterly report on the Community Investment Fund, he explained. I thought you'd want to review it before our meeting next week. The fund, established with profits from First Federal's reformed operations and supplemented by contributions from other participating institutions, had become a powerful tool for addressing historical inequities. It provided capital for small businesses in underserved neighborhoods, supported financial literacy programs, and funded affordable housing initiatives throughout Chicago. Eleanor accepted the envelope, reflecting on how their initial confrontation at First Federal had expanded into this multifaceted movement. What had begun as a response to personal humiliation had evolved into structural transformation affecting thousands of lives. I sometimes wonder what Walter would think of all this, she said, her thoughts turning to her late husband as they often did at moments of significance. He fought so hard for fair housing practices, but he never lived to see real change in banking. I suspect he would be proud but not surprised, Vincent replied. People who recognize injustice and choose to confront it rarely understand how far their influence will extend. Eleanor nodded, acknowledging the truth in his observation. Her own actions that day in First Federal's lobby, choosing dignity over humiliation, standing firm despite intimidation, had catalyzed changes far beyond anything she could have imagined. As they left the restaurant, Eleanor paused to look up at the clear night sky. At 75, she knew her active involvement in the Banking Equality Initiative wouldn't continue indefinitely. But she had helped build something that would outlast her structures, standards, and processes designed to sustain equitable practices regardless of who led them. The lasting legacy wasn't her name on the standards or her portrait on a bank wall. It was the elderly customer completing a transaction with dignity instead of suspicion, the family accessing financial services without barriers, the community seeing a bank as a partner rather than an adversary. Ready for tomorrow's sessions? Vincent asked as they prepared to part ways. Always, Eleanor replied with the quiet determination that had carried her through decades of both injustice and advocacy. There's still work to be done. As she returned to her hotel, Eleanor Wilkins reflected on the journey that had brought her from humiliation to influence, from invisibility to impact. The transformation hadn't erased the pain of that day in First Federal's lobby, but it had given it purpose, channeling righteous indignation into constructive change. What had begun as one woman's stand for dignity had become a movement for financial justice that would continue long after she departed the stage. That was a legacy worth all the struggle, a world where no one would face the humiliation she had endured simply for being elderly Black and determined to conduct her financial affairs with dignity. In the end, Eleanor's most powerful message wasn't delivered through speeches or standards, but through the simple truth her life had demonstrated. Dignity is not determined by wealth status or appearance. It is an inherent right that no institution should have the power to diminish or deny. And sometimes, standing firm in that knowledge can change everything. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful stories of dignity, respect, and transformation. Remember that one person standing up for what's right can create ripples of change that extend far beyond themselves. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination and wished someone would speak up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay courageous and remember your dignity is non-negotiable.